All right, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening, and we're so glad to have you joining us. My name's Tom. I'm one of the pastors here at Westside Christian Church, and we're so glad to have Steve in town again. And Dan actually had reached out to me. He was like, "Hey, do you think we could, have?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely. Have him come on over." So, just a couple things as we get started. If you need to use the restrooms, ladies, it's pretty obvious where yours is, right here in the lobby. But men, if you need to use the restroom, just go down that hallway. It's to the left there. If you need to find a restroom. Also, there is a donation box in the back. Steve, he does, you guys know, he does this stuff for free. He comes out, and so if you would like to bless his ministry, you can give in the box, and you can either give to the Narrow Path, which is his website and radio ministry, all that, or you can just give directly to Steve to cover his expenses. You can kind of mark either way, however you feel led to do that. So you didn't come to hear me speak, so without further ado, here's Steve. We're going to invite him up, and then let's pray. Come on up, and let's just pray that God will bless our time, and that He'll speak through Steve. Lord, bless Steve as he shares from Your Word, as he shares your spiritual principles about sexual purity, and it's a heavy topic in this world that we live in, and so Lord, just guide his words and open our hearts and our ears to hear what he has to say. Or what You have to say through him, Lord. And in Your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Good to be here again. Good to see many of you again.
It should be on.
Testing. Oh, there it is. It's way too on. Okay, great. All right. Well, this is always a very welcoming venue here. We always look forward to coming here. I was asked if I'd speak on sexual purity, which, of course, although talking about sex is almost always likely to draw a lot of interested people, there's hardly anything that people are more interested in, at least, at a certain level, then the subject of sex, although the subject of sexual purity is not anywhere near as interesting, or what's maybe interesting is not as popular. Let's put it that way. A lot of people like to hear about sex or think about sex or whatever, but to hear about sexual purity, it takes a special kind of person to want to hear about that. Usually that's somebody who is trying to defeat the world and the flesh and the devil, which is what we want to do. And the sexual urges, sexual drives are among the strongest that we have. They're not the strongest, but the other ones don't require so much restriction. Actually, the desire to breathe is the strongest urge we have, and we'll die most quickly if we don't indulge that urge. Drinking water, for example, or liquid, that's a strong urge too, and we'll die within a few days if we don't indulge that one. Eating, obviously, is a strong appetite. Sleep is a strong natural appetite, and so is sex. The difference between sex and the other ones is there's much more restriction on the legitimate use of that. I mean, I don't know of any restrictions on breathing or drinking liquid. Of course, there's such a thing as gluttony. You don't want to eat too much, but there's no specific, boundaries about eating, except, of course, to the Christian. Paul said, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. But those are all activities that you can indulge in a great deal, almost whenever you want to, and it's not a moral issue. In fact, Paul made that very clear, that it's not a moral issue. Because when he wrote to the Corinthians, he had to explain to them that the indulgence of the sexual appetite is not on the same level as the indulgence of the food appetite. Because when Paul had come to Corinth and planted the church there originally, he was carrying a letter from the Jerusalem Council, about which we read in Acts chapter 15. And the Jerusalem Council was there to decide whether the converts to Christianity out of the pagan world, whether they needed to become Jews before they could actually be regarded full-on Christians. And becoming a Jew for a pagan means you get circumcised. And you get circumcised and you agree to keep the law of Moses. Now, when you and I hear about the law of Moses, it may be that the first thing you think of is you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, those kind of laws, Ten Commandment type laws. But really what was at issue was whether they had to keep all those ritual laws. Don't eat this, don't eat that, don't touch this, don't touch that, you'll be unclean. Make sure you observe special holidays, holy days, and rituals. Those are the laws that were at issue, because everyone who knows God knows you can't go out and murder and commit adultery and steal. But there was some question in the church. What about these other rituals that distinguish the Jews from Gentiles? If a Gentile wants to be saved, should they become a Jew first so that they can keep all the same rules that the early Christians, who were all Jews, kept? And of course, the Jerusalem Council made the decision that that's not necessary. Gentiles don't have to adopt these laws. But they did say, however, Gentiles do a lot of things with their liberty that might offend the Jews in their towns. And every town has had the synagogues there preaching the law of Moses for many generations, as they said. And therefore, we would like to request that the Gentiles, even though they don't have to come under the Jewish law, we'd like to ask them to refrain from certain things that are particularly offensive to their Jewish neighbors, because we frankly don't want to offend the Jews. We'd like to make them open-minded about becoming Christians themselves, which they won't if they look at Gentile Christians as debauched people who do disgusting things. And so they made a list of 4 things. They said to Paul and Barnabas, when you go out to the Gentile churches, please tell them, we're not requiring them to get circumcised or keep the law, but we would like them to refrain from these 4 things. And those 4 things were eating blood, eating animals that had been strangled, eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and fornication. Now, when Paul came to Corinth and other Gentile cities, he delivered this letter from the council. And he said, listen, you're Gentiles, you don't have to keep the Jewish law, don't have to please the Jews, but there are some things, offensive things to the Jews, that the brothers in Jerusalem would like for you to avoid. And that is eating blood, eating things strangled, eating meat sacrificed to idols, and fornication. Now, Paul was not as stringent about the eating things. Paul knew, for example, that Jesus had said, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you, it's what comes out of your mouth. So he made all foods clean. In fact, in Romans 14:14, Paul said, I know and I'm persuaded by the Lord Jesus Christ that there's nothing unclean of itself. But to him who eats it, if he thinks it's unclean to him. But in other words, Paul had a lot of liberty about that. And he didn't want his converts to get the wrong impression. Like if they would eat an unclean food of some kind, that somehow they're going to go to hell or God's angry at them. So I believe, and we don't read of him teaching this, but we can see that he did because of how he had to correct them when he wrote to them later. He must have said, these 4 things the council wanted you to do, but frankly, God doesn't care that much what you eat and drink. This is just a consideration of not offending other people. The Jews will be offended if they see you eat blood or eat meat sacrificed to idols. So they're asking you not to do this. It's a matter of just not offending people. It's not really a matter of sin in the sight of God. Well, when Paul left, some of the teachers in Corinth were saying, well, Paul said all things are lawful for us. Yeah, the Jerusalem Council said don't do these things, but Paul said God doesn't care about these things. Now, what they failed to make the distinction about was dietary laws versus fornication. See, that list of 4 things, 3 of them had to do with what you eat, 1 had to do with fornication. And we have to remember that the Greek culture and Greek religions did not see fornication as a moral issue. If anything, it was part of their religion to fornicate. In Corinth, for example, there was a temple to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, and there were 1,000 prostitutes there that were the priestesses of that religion. If you wanted to worship Aphrodite, you'd use the services of these prostitute priestesses. I mean, to us as Christians or even Jews, how can anyone think that's good? Well, the pagans were in darkness. They didn't know. To them, indulging their sex drive was just like indulging your appetite for food. And I go into all this only because we have now come full circle to a time in Western civilization where that's kind of the dominant attitude about the matter too. Of course, you desire to eat, and therefore, when you're hungry, you eat. If you desire to have sex, well, you just have sex. You can eat whatever you want to. You can also have sex with whoever you want to. I mean, this is how our culture thinks, who are not informed by Scripture. Now, frankly, when I was growing up, and when you older people were growing up, the society knew that fornication was not the same thing as, say, gluttony or eating, too much sugar or something like that. Fornication in America still was viewed as a sin even among the non-Christians. They still did it, many of them, but they were ashamed for it to be known. If a girl got pregnant outside of marriage, it was considered to be shameful. Not because she got caught, but because it means she was engaged in sex outside of marriage, which was considered to be morally scandalous. If people got divorced, it was considered to be scandalous within my lifetime. And if kids were sleeping together, they wouldn't move in together, without getting married. They might sleep secretly with each other. Moving in together was a very rare thing until at least the hippie movement came and the sexual revolution in the 60s. Because even though most of America was never comprised of Christians, it was nonetheless influenced by Christianity to such a degree, and people had such a reverence and even fear of the Bible. Many didn't want to obey it, and didn't, but they still knew the Bible, that's the Word of God. The Bible, that's the good book. Now, of course, we've come to a point in a single generation where even the unbelievers believed that the biblical norms of morality were good, even if they didn't want to submit to them. They knew they were good. They knew they should. We've come around a place where even the Christians aren't sure whether the biblical norms are good. I mean, it shouldn't surprise us if people who don't know anything about God or about the Bible or don't care about God or the Bible, if they just indulge whatever desires they have, they answer to no higher power that they know of. But what's scary, really, is that we now have the world's philosophy about this permeating the church. And, Paul did make a distinction between unbelievers and believers in this matter. In 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in an epistle. There was apparently an epistle Paul wrote to the Corinthians before 1 Corinthians. We don't have that, but he mentions it. He says, I wrote to you an epistle not to associate with fornicators. But he said, I didn't mean the fornicators of this world, that is the pagans. Of course, he says you'd have to go out of the world to avoid them. I mean, all the pagans are fornicators. And I'm not saying you can't associate with non-Christians who are fornicators, but he said if anyone calls himself a brother, that is, if they're a professing Christian, and they're a fornicator, don't have anything to do with them. He's saying, it's wrong for pagans to fornicate, but we can't dictate to them what they do. They're not committed to following Jesus. We can call them to follow Jesus. We can call them to commit themselves to Jesus, but as long as they haven't done that, we can't dictate moral norms to them. It's only those who have submitted to Christ and recognized his authority who are required to live the way he said. The pagans are required to do, in a sense, by God, but we can't require them to do it. They'll be judged for not doing it, but we're not in the position to judge them. In that same chapter, 1 Corinthians 5, Paul said, for what have I to do with judging those who are outside the church? We need to judge those who are inside the church. Those who are outside, God judges. So if people sin, they're going to get judged. But those outside the church will be judged by God, and those inside the church, we're supposed to judge. The church is supposed to maintain its own high standards in order that it's distinctive from the world in terms of its obedience and likeness to Christ. Now, so we want to talk about the distinctive attitude towards sexual purity that comes with being a Christian. And I have to say, fornication, it's not even regarded to be shameful in many churches. I think most pastors, even the most liberal of them, if they were asked whether people should fornicate, first of all, they'd feel uncomfortable with the word fornicate. Fornicate, that just sounds so sinful. They just love each other. No, they don't just love each other. They're having sex. That's not the same thing. It's great if when you are having legitimate sexual relationship within the bonds of marriage, if there's love there. But love and sex are not the same thing. And when, especially we began to hear in the past decade, mostly from the gay activists, they say, well, you can't tell us who to love. No one can tell you who you can love. I've said, I've never had the slightest interest in telling you who you can love. I think you ought to love everybody. The Bible says you should love your enemies and love your friends and love your wife and love your children. Loving people is what we're supposed to do. That's not the same thing. We're not saying that you shouldn't love whoever you want to love. In fact, you should probably love a lot of people you don't want to love. We're not talking about love, we're talking about sex. Love should be universal. Sex obviously should be restricted because God made it for a purpose, and that's a very special purpose. And the reason that Christian ethics forbids all sex outside of marriage is not because sex is a dirty thing. If that were so, we'd be saying only married people are allowed to get dirty, No, marriage is honorable. It says in Hebrews 13, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed is undefiled. But adulterers and fornicators, God will judge, it says. Now, it's not that sex is a dirty thing, it's the opposite. God made sex for a very specific purpose, and it's a very sacred purpose, very restricted. Just like, the temple could only be used for one thing because it was set aside for that one thing. So sexuality is set aside for one thing, and that is marriage. That's what God made it for. And we have to remember that it is God who thought up sex. Again, if a lot of people, and I find this used to be true, I don't know if it still is with a lot of people who were raised Catholic, but probably some Protestants too, but Catholics my age, many of them were raised with the idea that sex is dirty, even in marriage. Sex is just a dirty category. It's an unnecessary evil. You got to do it to reproduce the human race, but you got to feel bad about it at least. You can't feel good about it. And this is a very harmful thing. It's been very harmful for marriages, especially if one or both of the parties, especially if it's the woman, was raised with these ideas that sex is something that maybe you have to do to have kids, but you better not think it's okay. You just maybe have to go do penance or something afterwards. I don't think they really have that view, but the point is, sex is never seen in the Bible as a dirty thing. It is restricted because it's a sacred thing. It's not something you just throw out in the gutter and just let everyone at it. It's got a very specific purpose. And we need to talk about that first before we talk about the wrong uses of sex, because if you stand for biblical norms about sexuality, someone's going to say you're homophobic or transphobic, or if you're not moving with the culture on their changing views about sexual norms, they'll say you're phobic, which literally means afraid. Now, I'm not at all afraid of homosexuals. I've never met a homosexual I was afraid of, except one guy when I was a young kid, teenager, hitchhiking, and I got picked up by this really big guy, and I just wanted a ride. He wanted something else, and when I found out what he wanted, I said, I'll get off at this ramp now. But he was propositioning me. Now, I was kind of scared there because I was little, he was big, and he was the aggressor. But I in general, that's not, if it had been a big woman that was trying to do that to me, I would have felt the same way. It's not his sex, it's the issue, And I know, of course, as you do, numerous people who are homosexuals, as they say, they identify as that way, but I can't remember being afraid of any of them. To call it homophobia is ridiculous. But it is not ridiculous to say, I'm a little concerned, maybe even a little afraid, of the homosexual movement activists that are trying to destroy all the sexual norms. Not because it'll hurt me. Once again, when they were still campaigning for same-sex marriage, they say, well, what do you care about? It won't hurt your marriage. If these two gay people can get married to each other, how does that affect you? And my answer was, I don't think it affects me at all. But I'm not just concerned about me. If I was a narcissist like you are, I judge everything by how does it affect me. I'm not a narcissist. I'm concerned about my fellow man. I'm concerned about my children, my grandchildren. I'm concerned about the society that we leave to them and the confusion that comes if they were raised in a society where nobody knows what marriage is, which every society in history knew until the past 30 years. And if people don't know what marriage is for, if they don't know what sex is for, we have yet to see the damage that can be done, but we've seen a lot of it. We've seen the trend. I think it can get a lot worse. I guess Sodom and Gomorrah probably went further down that path than we have yet, or more universally. I mean, we've got some pockets of society that are probably about like Sodom and Gomorrah, but there's still a lot of Christian values among people who aren't in that pocket. But frankly, a society that forgets what marriage is, what family is, what sex is a society that's frankly doomed to disintegrate and have many, many victims. And so, I mean, the reason I don't want there to be, although there is, a confusion over what marriage is because not because of me. My wife and I are not confused about what it is. My kids are, I don't think, confused about what it is. My grandkids, who knows what they'll know. And great-grandkids. Yeah, we're concerned about issues because God cares about them, and God cares about them because God cares about people. And we care about people. We say if you depart from God's norms, people will suffer. You yourself will suffer if you depart from them, but if a society does, that society will suffer. We need to understand that God, when he made human beings, the first society he built was a marriage. There was a man alone, and God said, it's not good for a man to be alone, so I'm going to make a helper for him. And this was the first relationship and the first social entity that God created. And it's defined in Genesis 2:24, where it says, for this cause, a man will leave his father and his mother and will cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now, what does that mean? Well, we might not know if Jesus hadn't quoted it and expounded on it. And by the way, Paul did too. That very verse, Genesis 2:24, was quoted by Jesus and by Paul. In the case of Jesus' quotation of it, he was saying, listen, have you not read how God made things in the beginning? And this was in answer to a question that was actually about divorce, which is extremely relevant to the whole issue of family and marriage and sexual norms. But he was asked about divorce because in some religions, almost all religions, divorce is permitted in some cases. But the question is, for what cases? And the Pharisees didn't have the same opinion as each other. There's the school of Shammai that allowed divorce for only fornication, and there's a school of Hillel that allowed divorce for just about any reason a man wanted it. And so they came and said, Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And they're asking Jesus to give his opinion between the two denominations within the Pharisees, the Shammaites and the Hillelites. And Jesus said, well, haven't you heard how God made it from the beginning? How he said that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then he said, what God has joined together, and of course he gets that from that last line of the quote, they become one flesh. They become one flesh not by some human action, but by God's action. God joins them together as one. He says, what God has joined together, do not let man break apart. So he's saying, if you knew the scriptures, you'd know that it was God who created marriage. It's God who said that they are now one flesh by God's decree and by God's design. And if you break it apart, you're going against God. So don't divorce. And they said to him, well, then why did Moses allow us to give a writing of divorcement and divorce our wives? Jesus said, well, because of the hardness of your heart, God permitted that, but from the beginning it was not so. Now, by that statement, from the beginning it was not so, he's saying we should not be concerned about what God will permit due to the fallen state of things where God endures a great deal of disappointment with people's behavior. How much will God tolerate? That's not what we should be asking. A lot of people, when I was young and a teenager, that's when I started teaching the Bible, and most people I was teaching were teenagers too. And I'd often be asked, what can you do on a date? Can you do this much or that much? And they'd explain different activities that they were apparently tempted to do. As a Christian, can you do that? Can you do that? And I was saying, as I'll say tonight, the Christian's concern is not how much can I get away with. Our question is not how far can we get from the known will of God and still be okay. That's religion. We're not advocating religion. We're advocating a relationship with God where you love God and you want to please God and you're not concerned about how much he may forgive, but how much he wants. Not what will he permit and what will he tolerate, but really what will please him, what makes him happy. And so Jesus said, yeah, God permitted you to divorce your wives, but it wasn't that way from the beginning. In other words, God didn't make Adam and Eve with the mind for them to divorce, and they didn't. It wasn't until the law of Moses was given that there were, there was some permission to divorce in certain cases. And I believe there still is in certain cases. Not half as many as people would like there to be. But Jesus said, yeah, but God didn't make it that way at the beginning. And by that statement, he's saying, instead of wondering how much God may tolerate, why don't we ask if we can get a fix on what is the perfect will of God? I think we can get a clue from seeing how he made things. How did he want human sexuality to be? Now, you have to remember that God could have made humans asexual. There are a class of living things that are asexual. There are microorganisms that reproduce without a mate. There are even some strange, rare sea creatures that seem to be able to reproduce without a mate. In fact, I didn't know this until recently, but there are pythons and even Komodo dragons that have been known in zoos to become pregnant and lay eggs without being exposed to a mate. There's apparently some very rare cases where some animals, and we know of some that are made to do this, they reproduce without a mate. They're asexual. Now, in the cases of the pythons and the Komodo dragons, they are not asexual, but they seem to be an exception. They usually reproduce sexually like most creatures, but I guess there can be exceptions with them. But with people, there's not. The only case we know of a virgin birth was a miracle and a one-time deal. It was a one-off. It wasn't something that happens occasionally or rarely. It was a unique case. It's not going to happen again. Never happened before that. But God made us the way he wanted us. He didn't make us asexual. He made us sexual. When God said it's not good for man to be alone, I'm going to make a helper for him. Actually, a helper equal to him is pretty much what the phrase means. Well, if God wants to make someone equal to him, he could have just made another man, couldn't he? Why didn't he make, a man to be a companion for Adam? They could both be asexual creatures that didn't have sex with each other or anyone else, and God could have made them to reproduce like amoebas do, but they could just be friends. If it's bad for a man to be alone because it's lonely, well, he can have friends. Interestingly, many men find even if they have no sexual attraction, they find more camaraderie with other men. I think many women find more camaraderie with other women. God didn't just make a man and a woman because that was the best way to have companions, because they could have had other kinds of companions. What he made was creatures, two different varieties of the same species that fit together like a key and a lock. And a key and a lock are one mechanism. You go to a hardware store, you don't find the locks over here, and you buy one of those and you go find a key over in another section. The key and the lock come together because they are made to work together. They're not the same as each other, but they both are necessary. And God made it so that men and women are necessary to each other to do what's supposed to happen with them. Now, what was supposed to happen with them? Well, the first instructions God gave them was be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We know from that sex was not a dirty thing or a bad thing. It was a command of God. He gave them no way to reproduce other than sexually, so he expected them to be sexually active. That's what he made them for. In fact, God doesn't have to make things that are necessary pleasant. God does that only because he's good. because he's loving. Do you realize that God could make us so that we could be nourished by food that has no flavor at all? But he made all these different flavors, and he gave us taste buds. If we had no capacity to taste, we could still be required to eat. It's necessary biologically for us to eat, and God just gave us taste buds and all these different flavors because he wants us to enjoy it. He's not required to do that. That's just out of his generosity. Likewise, with reproduction, he could have made it necessary for people to reproduce sexually, but made it very bland or not particularly enjoyable. But God, since there are things he wanted to make sure we don't neglect, because they're essential for the human race and even for our own good, he made those things most important and most indispensable, also pleasurable, so that we'd enjoy them, and so that we wouldn't neglect them. So God made sex. God made the sex organs, he made the sex drive, he made the hormones that make people interested in sex. You know, we don't realize this because we do not exist without hormones, but if we just didn't have the chemicals we have in our bodies, male and female hormones, there would be no interest in sex. It still might be, we wouldn't even be able to engage in it, but the point is, God put the right chemicals in us so that we'd be drawn to that, and it would be enjoyable, and it would be fruitful, and we would multiply and fill the earth. That's what God made, and that's the only place in which God wants there to be sex. Now, there may be practical reasons why it's better not to have sex outside of marriage, but there's one very important spiritual reason, and that's what Paul tells us in in this case, Ephesians 5. And he also, like Jesus did, he quotes Genesis 2:24. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. Paul quotes that, just like Jesus did. But then Paul says, this is a great mystery, but I'm speaking of Christ and the church. Now, what Paul's saying is, sex, of course, in addition to the obvious purpose of reproduction, which, the human race would die off within a few years if there was no reproduction, so that God made it for that. But he also made it to be a picture of Christ and the church. That is a picture of the relationship God wants to have with his people. And that's why in that context in Ephesians 5, Paul says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, submit to your husbands as the church submits to Christ in all things. Why? Because God made marriage to be a picture of that. Now, what's interesting is part of marriage is obviously sex. And is that kind of outside the realm of the general purpose of marriage? If the general purpose of marriage is to be like Christ in the church, is it kind of dirty to think of, sex between married partners as involved in that, reflecting that reality too? I think not. This idea of God being married to his people comes from the Old Testament. We get it in the New Testament with Christ and the church. In the Old Testament, the same analogy was used for Israel and God. At Mount Sinai, God entered a covenant. Marriage is a covenant. He entered into a covenant relationship with Israel. Collectively, Israel was his wife, he said. And the most important thing to him was that they don't worship other gods. Why? He said that would be cheating. That would be adultery. And, it's interesting in the Old Testament how often you find certain leaders in Israel, they do all kinds of things wrong, and sometimes God still sees them as, say, a good king. But another king doesn't do more things wrong, but he's considered a bad king. But the difference is the bad king was the one who led Israel to worshiping idols. God doesn't want us to do any sins at all, but many sins will be tolerated more than others, just like in marriage. In marriage, a husband and wife, they make promises to each other. Their promises are they'll be perfect. You ever heard of marriage vows? I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to love you, cherish you. I'll die for you. I'm going to, I'll be the greatest thing that ever happened to you. And she says the same thing to him. And hopefully they mean it. I think in many cases they do. But the spirit may be willing and the flesh is weak, and people are very flawed. And therefore, all marriages are characterized by flawed partners. And flaws in your partner can be annoying. They can be painful. They can be expensive, depending on the kinds of flaws they have. See, a guy's got a gambling problem or something, you know, or a wife's just unrestrained in her spending, and drives the family broke. I mean, they're flaws in a partner can be very costly, can be very painful, can be very annoying, and very tempting to say, I'm out of here. I'm going to bail. But Jesus said, no, the only grounds for divorce is fornication. He said, if a man divorces his wife for any cause other than fornication, he causes her to commit adultery, and he himself, when he remarries, commits adultery. So nothing can break that marriage covenant except fornication. That is, one of them having sex with somebody else who's not their partner. Every other thing, she may burn the food, she may be unpleasant, he may snore, he may leave the toilet seat up, she may have an annoying laugh, he may not use deodorant or bathe often enough. And I mean, I've known some people, good, nice people who've got terrible breath. I think, how does their spouse not tell them about this? It's like, when they're talking about it, I really think, am I going to survive this? It's almost like, mustard gas or something, it's chemical warfare. Honestly, there's some very annoying things that people have that really challenge their ability to be, with each other and live with each other. But none of those things are grounds for divorce. But if one of them goes out and sleeps with someone else, that is grounds for divorce. Just like with Israel. God didn't divorce Israel because she kept being carnal in many, many ways, which displeased him. It's just like if your husband or wife has annoying habits, it displeases you. But being displeased is not grounds for breaking up. The only thing it is, when Israel went after other gods, God said, that's like a wife going after other men. In other words, the sexual relationship between a husband and wife is analogous to worship between God's people and him. You shall worship the Lord your God, and him alone shall you serve, Jesus said in response to the devil's temptation in Luke 4 and Matthew 4. And to worship God only is the obligation of God's people, just like to only sleep with your partner is the obligation of married people. Now, interesting that God, in trying to build on earth in a human relationship, an analogy to his relationship with his people, and in looking for something to correspond to the phenomenon of unique worship, created a unique sexual obligation, as if the sexual relationship is itself a picture of worship. And of course, worship, if you love somebody, if you love God, worshiping him is extremely pleasurable. In fact, it can be, it may not have been in the experience of everybody here, but I've certainly known times, it can be more ecstatic than any other earthly experience on occasion. That's what it should be, and you can't always be blamed if it isn't, because we're not perfect people, but in ideal worship situations, you feel elevated into the heavenlies. Sex can be like that too, between married partners. I mean, sex is a good analogy for worship because people who don't worship God worship sex anyway. I mean, sex is the kind of thing that the world is drawn to worship, which is why Corinth had 1,000 prostitutes in their temple. What were they worshiping there? Aphrodite, the goddess of sex, really. Men, whether they do it so blatantly as the Corinthians did or otherwise, if they aren't loyal to God, they're going to probably, more often than not, be worshiping and serving sex, because their drive is very strong, and there are things about it that are uniquely pleasurable. There's many pleasures in life, but that's the pleasure in that relationship at its best is not like anything else. And God made that to be a picture of the way we express our love to him in worship. Now, there's children here and so forth, so I don't want to be too explicit, but I used to wonder, why do so many animals, when they reproduce, do it not face to face? If you've had dogs or cows or horses or goats, we've had all of them. My family and I, when they reproduce, they're not looking at each other face to face. They're just doing a deed to get the job done. But God made humans to be face to face in that encounter, because I believe it is a picture of our worshiping him. All we with unveiled faces beholding as in the mirror the glory of the Lord are changed from glory to glory through into that same image, where it's a face-to-face encounter with God when we worship God. So I mean, there's many analogies there, but the point I'm trying to make is, even if we don't fathom all the analogies or don't understand them all, we're dealing with something that's unique here. We're talking about something that's not just a biological drive that has no other meaning. And so when Paul found that the Corinthians were getting confused about that in 1 Corinthians 6, when they were saying, oh, Paul said all things are lawful, and that meant we can fornicate as well as eat these other things, he wrote to them in chapter 6 and said, wait a minute, all things are lawful, but not all things edify. And he said, food is for the body, and the body is for food, and God will destroy the stomach and the food. Eventually, they're not permanent, but the body was not made for fornication. In other words, he's saying the Jerusalem Council asked you to refrain from eating certain things. And I'm telling you, God's not all about that. He's not all about what you eat. If you don't eat one thing or you do eat another thing, that's not an issue to God. What enters your mouth is not what defiles you, so it comes out from your heart. But fornication is in the list, but it's not in the same category. The appetite for food is not, or the indulgence of the appetite for food is not in the same category as the indulgence of the sex drive, because food doesn't have that same spiritual significance as God built into the uniqueness of the marriage relationship. And God guards over that more jealously. Just like a husband and wife do, at least the one who's not cheating. Obviously, a husband and wife can both be tempted to cheat, because we can be tempted to do almost anything that's pleasurable. We get tempted to. That's the nature of being human, frankly. But the person who doesn't want to cheat, when they suspect or know that their spouse wants to cheat or is cheating, that's not just something to say, she never was a good cook anyway, so what do I care who she's sleeping with? No man thinks like that, unless he's already given up on the marriage himself. Anyone who cares about their marriage realizes that, sexual faithfulness of their spouse matters more than anything else. In fact, it has been said that adultery is the most cruel, non-violent act that one can do against another person. There are perhaps more cruel things you can do physically, torture someone, kill somebody, burn somebody at the stake. There are violent acts that might be more cruel, but among non-violent acts, there's nothing more cruel than adultery, and nothing that is more likely to go unpardoned by the cheated party. Solomon says that as he's telling his son to make sure he avoids being seduced by other men's wives. Now, it's interesting, Solomon in Proverbs says a lot about the strange woman, the foreign woman, he's talking about a prostitute. But he's always describing, in those cases, a married woman who's prostituting. She says, my husband's gone on a long trip, he's taking a lot of money, he won't be back for a while, come on over. And, it's typical, but that's not because it's not because that's the only prostitutes it's wrong to go to. It's just that in Jewish society, almost all young girls were married. And some of them, were not very faithful to their husbands, and maybe, of course, a lot of young girls married old men. This is kind of typical in Middle Eastern society. It may be that the woman was not very satisfied with her husband, so she, was tempted to go another way. But what Solomon says to his son about this, he said in verse 26, in verse 25, he says, do not lust after her beauty in your heart, nor let her allure you with her eyelids. For by means of a harlot, A man is reduced to a crust of bread, and an adulteress will prey upon his precious life. Now that makes it look like she's the bad guy. She's preying, she's the predator, and so forth. Well, some women are. Obviously, men are predators maybe more often. I don't know, you women might know more than I do about how predatory women are. I've never been inside a woman's brain. I've been married for many years to a woman, but that doesn't guarantee that you have any understanding of what goes on inside their brain. As husbands know, and frankly, wives know too. Well, yeah, my husband doesn't understand anything. You see, and honestly, not to get off on this, but women do usually expect their husbands to know what's going on inside their brains. And that's one of the great complaints that husbands have. I can't read her mind, and she gets mad at me because I don't. Well, we won't get into that. I'm not sure of an easy solution to that, but I will say this. I've never been inside a woman's head. I've been in a man's head. And I'm much more, I've known more men and talked about these kinds of issues with more men than with women, and I know men are predatory. But I'm saying you women might know, yeah, well, the women I know, there are a lot of predatory women out there too. I know there are some. Solomon knew of some because he had observed it. He actually started watching out the window once, and a young man who had no good sense to him was walking down the harlot street, and she came out and she was alluring him and tempting him and flattering him, and so there are predators both ways. But he said he's thinking in terms of avoid these predatory women. He says, for by means of a harlot a man is reduced to a crust of bread, and an adulteress will prey upon his precious life. Obviously, men who are predatory do the same thing in the other direction. He says, can a man take fire into his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Now, this comparison of sexual misbehavior with taking coals of fire into your clothing, how can you do that and your clothes don't get burned? Now, anyone who's been in the church for very long and has heard, especially in youth groups, talks about stay away from sexual sin, has heard the analogy of sex and fire. Maybe you weren't raised in the church and didn't hear that, but I've heard it more times than I can remember. It's a very good one. It's biblical. You see, what preachers often say, and what we often need to hear, is there's nothing wrong with fire, just like there's nothing wrong with sex, as long as the fire is in the fireplace or in a place that it's safe to be, where it's supposed to be. But once the fire leaps out of the fireplace onto the carpet or onto the curtains or onto the furniture, then you've got serious destruction going on. We have a family here who had a house in Paradise that burned down a few years ago, and many of you are close enough to Paradise to remember that. I remember it. I wasn't very close to it, but I mean, how destructive fire is when it gets out of the areas that it's useful. Fire is useful for cooking, for heating, and for a number of things. Disinfecting, but it's not useful when it gets out of control, when it's outside the boundaries that you want it to be in. Then it's nothing but destructive. And that's, of course, how the sex drive is. As long as your sex drive is in the boundaries where God wants it, which is in marriage, there's not a thing wrong with it. But as soon as it gets outside of there, it starts destroying everything. It destroys the lives of everyone involved and many others besides. For example, I mean, almost always, there's some exceptions, but almost always where adultery is found out in a marriage, generally speaking, a divorce follows. Now, there's some godly people. I frankly, I got married when I was 19. I thought I was marrying a Christian woman. She had a few affairs. She even told me about them. She didn't repent, but she wasn't shamed. She was a hippie. I thought she was converted, but I guess she still was a hippie and not very converted. Now, because I was a Christian, I thought, well, I have grounds for divorce, but I don't want a divorce. I mean, I don't like living with this woman, but I'm a Christian. It's a shame. It's a reproach to Christ. I'm not going to divorce her. I determined I would stay with her for the rest of my life, like I pledged I would when I made my vows, because Christians should keep their promises. They should be different than worldly people in that very respect, that you can trust Christians because they won't break their promises. And the reason is because we're supposed to reflect Christ to the world, and we want people to be able to trust him, knowing that he doesn't break his promises. And if you've never met anyone who doesn't break their promises, so you can't even fathom that, look at me, I don't break mine. That's what a Christian should be able to say. I will not misrepresent God by becoming unfaithful. Now, I had grounds for divorce, but I wouldn't take it because I thought, well, I did make promises. And so I didn't. And I would be still married to that woman, and she'd probably still be having affairs to this day, which is now 50-something years later, if she hadn't run off with someone else and divorced me, which was, I have to say, a divorce made in heaven. But a reproach still. It's still a reproach, even if it's a relief. It's a reproach. I didn't want it. But the point I'm making is, most cases of discovered adultery end up in divorce. I don't think one man in 20 would stay married permanently to a woman who he knows is having affairs. Some would. Sometimes they're just desperate. They don't think they'll find anyone else, and there may be they might do it for the kids, whatever. There are reasons some people would. But adultery almost always ends marriages, and the end of a marriage ends the prospects of very many people to have their dreams, their godly dreams come true. The children, most of all. Children are very much victimized by divorce. And the worldly people are going to say, oh no, kids are very resilient. They're resilient. And many times the divorcing spouse says, well, it's better for the kids that we live apart and be at peace with each other than that we live in the house and they witness this friction and fighting all the time. Well, how about a third option? How about live together and don't have all that friction and fighting all the time? How about be a godly person and don't contribute to any strife? Now, sure, one partner can do all the fighting, but a fight doesn't really escalate very much if only one person's doing it. And there are options. You don't have to divorce, you don't have to separate, but people make all kinds of excuses for divorcing because really the truth is they want out. It's the easy way. The hard way is to stay and make it work. But it is not true that the children benefit more from a couple breaking up and living peaceably apart than staying together. Almost every children of divorced families that have ever been interviewed said they wish their parents had stayed together. And of course, the children of divorced marriages are in a high-risk group for all kinds of antisocial behaviors, including addictions and immorality and other horrible things you don't want to list here. They're distasteful to even mention, but frankly, studies have proven this beyond the shadow of a doubt. If you divorce your spouse and you've got kids, you are instantly relegating your kids into a category that is like 80% more likely to commit suicide, be promiscuous, have their own marriages break up someday. Get on drugs or whatever. All bad stuff. And so I think divorcing your spouse should be a category of child abuse, really. But not just children. But children's important enough. If children were the only people hurt by it, that'd be an incredibly persuasive reason not to do it. But other people destroyed. And the worst of it is the reputation of Christ is destroyed. So we're not talking about divorce tonight, but divorce is a very natural product of adultery, a result of adultery. Either it is caused because of adultery, or it itself is adultery. So there's never a divorce where there's not adultery. Either adultery is the grounds for the divorce, which would not be there if there's no adultery, in which case the person who is faithful and is out, they're innocent, okay? They're the innocent party. But either adultery causes the divorce, or else the divorce itself is adultery. If you divorce your spouse and it wasn't for cause of adultery, you're committing adultery, at least if you remarry. And most people seek to do that. So it's all bad. Just getting the fire out of the fireplace into the carpet is destructive beyond calculation. And so this is one reason that Christians should be committed, even if it weren't otherwise an offense to God. We should be, for the sake of the other harm that it does, unwilling to to be unrestrained in our attitudes. Now, the Bible might say, well, what about unmarried people, having premarital sex? Well, that specific situation isn't mentioned very often in Scripture. I will say this, the law of Moses does show where the heart of God is on this matter, because if people are married or a single person has sex with a married person who's not married to them, that's adultery. And where there's adultery, both parties are put to death. It's a capital crime. It's like murder. You commit murder, you're stoned to death. You commit adultery, you're stoned to death. That's God's attitude. Adultery is as bad as murder or witchcraft or any other thing that the Bible says is a capital crime. But when an unmarried man seduced an unmarried and unbetrothed girl, they weren't put to death, but they were forced to marry. They were required to marry. Now, that doesn't mean it was okay. It means unmarried people shouldn't do that. And if you did it when you're unmarried, you got to become a married couple, because God, basically, you broke it, you bought it. So if you get into that kind of relationship that only belongs in marriage, well, shame on you. Get married now. And that's another way of saying sex doesn't belong outside of marriage. It sometimes occurs outside of marriage, but if it does, fix it by getting married. Now, I want to say this too. There are many people here who, before they were Christians, probably had multiple partners. And you might say, well, I'm supposed to go marry all those people? No. Actually, the law was if the girl was a virgin. If a man actually deflowered a virgin, she can't get that back. And in that society, she's less, to put it crassly, less marketable in the marriage market in Israel if she's not viewed as pure. So the man who defiled her has to take on the responsibility of being her husband and take care of her and never divorce her. It's interesting because the law of Moses did allow divorce for some causes, but not in that case. If a single man had sex with a virginal woman who's not betrothed to someone else, he had to marry her, and they can never divorce. So, that makes it very clear that God has no place in his economy for sex going on outside of marriage. And fornication, in the Greek, the word is porneia, which sounds a lot like one of our English words, porneia. And of course, our word pornography is based on that word, porneia. But porneia in the Greek means sexual immorality. In the older English, King James, it's translated fornication. But a lot of modern translations just call it sexual immorality. And there's a good reason for that. And that is because we sometimes think of fornication as only marriage that isn't adultery, like only premarital sex is fornication. But if people get married and then commit adultery, that's something else. But actually in the Bible, porneia is used for any kind of sexual activity that's not within the bounds of biblical marriage. So, for example, when a man was involved in an incestuous relationship with his father's wife, in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, Paul says, there's fornication in the church. Well, incest then was called fornication. In Jude, it says that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were involved in fornication. Well, they were involved in homosexual activity. In the Old Testament, in the Greek Old Testament, when God talked about Israel's worshiping other gods, he said that's fornication, which is really an analog of adultery. So really any kind, of course, bestiality was also sexual. There's a lot of different ways to be sexually sinful. And certainly we know the word fornication was used for prostitution. In other words, any kind of sexual misbehavior was under the umbrella term porneia. So when Jesus said if a man divorces his wife for any cause other than porneia, it means that the grounds for divorce are whatever may fall under the umbrella of porneia. And that would be if he gets involved in a gay relationship or with another woman or whatever, that's porneia. And again, it just underscores that there's only one proper place for sex to be, and that is within the marriage relationship. Now, of course, what the Bible teaches is, and Jesus taught this from Genesis 2:24, that a man and his wife become one flesh. He said, here's what you learn from the way God made it from the beginning. And whatever may have happened after the fall, that's not the norm for us. Our norm is, how did God make it? We figure the way he made it is the way he wanted it, and what we want is what he wants. That's just what it means to be a Christian. I've decided from now on, it's not about what I want, it's about what God wants. That's what repent does. When you repent, you change your mind. Before you repented, you wanted it your way. That's just natural. You repent and say, no, I don't want it my way. Jesus said, if you come to me, you have to deny yourself and take up your cross. No one would choose that, but you do that because you do what God wants. That's what changing your mind and repenting means. You now are not living to please yourself, but to please God. And what God was pleased by was what he made in the beginning, when he said it's very good, before it got very bad. And so we have a standard here that marriage is monogamous because God only made one wife for Adam. Now, did God tolerate polygamy in the Old Testament? He did. He also tolerated divorce and some other things. Because of the hardness of heart, God didn't enforce the highest standards on them, knowing how weak and foolish and carnal people were. He wasn't just going to strike everyone dead who did something wrong. He wouldn't have anyone left. So he, because of the hardness of their heart, he overlooked a lot of things. But he never wanted them. God never wanted there to be polygamy or divorce. He didn't make Adam several wives. And that's really remarkable when you think about it. Because God told Adam, be fruitful and fill the earth. Now, societies that allow polygamy usually have this interesting double standard. A man can have multiple wives, but a wife can't have multiple husbands. And that's generally true everywhere that polygamy is practiced. Why? Why the double standard? Well, for the simple reason that a man might impregnate many women and multiply his family rather quickly, and there'd never any question about who the mother is or the father is. But if a woman had many husbands, no one would know who's dad. Yeah, who's your daddy? I don't know. Mom had 6 husbands, You wouldn't, the parentage of a child would be in question, and you wouldn't multiply children any faster. A woman with 7 husbands would still have only one baby at a time. Every 9 months she could have one maybe, but not more than that unless she had twins. But a man with many wives could have a lot. Now, what I'm saying is that's what society recognized when they allowed polygamy. Yeah, a man could have many wives because he could multiply his family that way. In fact, in the Bible, most of the men that we know of by name who had more than one wife, and most men did not, by the way, even when polygamy was allowed, it wasn't normative. Abraham had a sterile wife, a barren wife. And it was she who said, why don't you have a baby with Hagar, my servant? And Hagar became a second wife to him. And that wasn't even his idea, that was hers. But the point was, it would never come up if Sarai had been able to give him children, but she couldn't, so she said, well, you got to have children. Here, take her. And the same would be true of Jacob and his 4 women. Rachel was barren initially, and so he had children by Leah. But he only really wanted to be married to Rachel, and she eventually had children too. But then both of them had periods where they stopped having children, and so they said, here, take my maid and have children with her. He ended up with 4 women who were technically wives. 2 were concubines, so that's another kind of wife in this society. But only because of barrenness or to multiply children where there was a stoppage there. You see, even Hannah, the mother of Samuel, was almost certainly the second wife of her husband. And the first wife was still living, Peninnah. But, I'm sorry, Peninnah was almost certainly the second wife, my mistake. I think Hannah was the first wife, but she was barren. And so her husband married a woman who could give him children. Now, although the Bible sometimes records that there were polygamous families, it never records one case of a happy one. Interesting that. Because, the Bible might well have just told us about these without mentioning how happy or unhappy they were. In every case, the Bible goes out of the way to show there's conflict. Whenever there's more than one wife or children of more than one wife, the children are at each other's throats. David had 8 wives and his kids killed each other. Or Hannah and Peninnah, they had strife. Rachel and Leah had strife. Hagar and Sarah had strife. You never find one instance in the Bible of a polygamous family that the people are happy about it. It's almost like it was just a functional thing. We got to have more kids here. Having kids was a very important thing in the minds of those cultures. And that's probably the main reason why they were open to polygamy. But that's not how God wanted it from the beginning. If God wanted Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, that'd happen a lot faster if God gave him 100 women. He could have 100 children a year instead of 1 a year. Now, the fact that God wanted the whole world populated and didn't give Adam more than 1 wife, which would have been practically very helpful for that project, means that there were overriding concerns that overrode the practicality. God wanted the earth populated, but not at the expense of making a polygamous marriage, which would have made it faster, but there was an overriding concern, monogamy, 1 husband, 1 wife. And why is that? In the Old Testament, no one knew why, although they could see that polygamy was not a happy arrangement. But in the New Testament, we know it's a picture of Christ in the church. He only has 1 body. He only has 1 bride. And for a man to have more than 1 wife muddies that picture, and that's not what God had in mind. So God intended for marriage to be monogamous and faithful and lifelong. That's what Jesus said. What God has joined together, don't let man break apart. Now, it might be that you, like myself, have been in a previous marriage which may have broken up on biblical grounds. Now, I didn't divorce my wife, but I was certainly felt free when she divorced me because she had been having affairs, the first wife. And that being so, I would say that a person may be a victim of divorce. And you might say, but God said, don't let anyone break it up. Well, the person who commits adultery is the one who's breaking it up. God joins together. The covenant is broken by adultery. And whoever commits the adultery is the one who breaks it up. Sometimes being divorced is not your fault. And I've always heard people say, who don't know what they're talking about, there are no innocent parties in a divorce. Ever heard that line? That's a common line. There are no innocent parties in a divorce. Well, if you mean there's no perfect parties in a divorce, of course, there's no perfect human beings. There are, everyone who is a victim of their spouses divorcing them wrongfully has been an imperfect spouse. But that doesn't mean they're not innocent of the divorce. Both sides are imperfect spouses. The only one who causes the divorce is the one who says, I'm out of here. I'm going to take up with someone else, or I'm going to leave this marriage. That's the person guilty. And that certainly often is the case that only one person is guilty of that. Yeah, I mean, anyone who's an innocent party in a divorce can still, castigate themselves in memory of things they did that weren't as good as they should have been. I would think anyone who's been divorced looks back and says, oh, I could have done that better, I could have done that better. But that doesn't mean you caused the divorce. Being imperfect doesn't cause a divorce. Both parties are imperfect, but only the person who says, okay, I'm done here. That person causes a divorce. And Jesus said, don't do that, whether it's by committing adultery and causing your spouse to have grounds for divorce, or divorcing your spouse when they haven't committed adultery. Then you become the adulterer. So Jesus said God had monogamous, lifelong, faithful, and by the way, heterosexual unions in mind. Now, when our country decided to legalize same-sex marriages, people say, well, they're redefining marriage. No, they're not. They're undefining marriage. Marriage has no definition now. There's, when you decide that marriage should be permitted and authorized and legalized and celebrated as long as 2 people love each other, well, why do they have to be people? Why can't it be somebody and their dog? And although that sounds facetious, it's a real question, because there are actually people who want to marry their pets. There's been court cases where they wanted to do that. Why can't a person marry his granddaughter? There are people who actually have said they want to do that. I mean, as soon as you say marriage is whenever two people love each other and want to have sex together, then that's or two creatures, then we're going to let that be marriage. Well, then we've put no boundaries around marriage at all. The truth is, there was never any legitimate redefinition of marriage, because as soon as you gave up the biblical definition of marriage, you replaced it with nothing. I mean, I'd be very interested in knowing what a dictionary today would put under marriage. There'd probably be such a loosey-goosey, vague thing there, because, it's changing in people's minds all the time. But what changes in people's minds doesn't mean it changes in God's mind. And we will not be judged by what people think. We'll be judged by what God thinks. And people who are Christians are those who don't mind going against the status quo of the world and going with what God says. You'll be called a hater. You'll be called phobic. You'll be called other things. You might even be beat up. You never know. You might lose a job just for saying you believe that sex or that marriage is a man and a woman. There are people who've done that. Who was the guy who was, what was he, the head of something, Google or something, a former head of one of these big corporations. He just had said, actually years earlier, he had written in a social media thing that marriage is a man and woman. And later that became not okay to say, and he got fired. He was like the vice president of one of these big corporations. It was in the news. But we have to say, okay, if the world hates me, though none go with me, still I will follow. I'm going to be faithful to Jesus. And that means we're going to have to be different than the world. And it's going to be more and more obvious that we're different from the world, because this is the area that the world is changing most quickly on. And it's the darling of the unsaved world, is the sexual revolution, the sexual freedom. It's got no boundaries now of any kind. And when you want to put any kind of boundaries on it, even if they tolerate the boundaries you put on it today, like you say, no, you can't marry your granddaughter. Well, wait another 5 years and see if those boundaries hold up. When you don't have God's boundaries, you got no logical stopping place for that. Now, I'm going to give you a break in just a minute, but I just want to say this. We know that Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, your mind is your thinking. It's your thoughts, your attitudes, your beliefs, your opinions. That's your mind. We're not talking about the physical brain. The Christian's physical brain as an organ made up of neurons doesn't, as far as I know, change significantly as a result of being a Christian. The brain is like the heart or the lung. It's a physical organ. But the mind is the processes of thought. And that's what has to be renewed. And that's what you have to not care whether your thinking conforms with the world or not. So do not be conformed to the world. It's a very unpopular thing to stand against the world. I remember the first time I remember that verse coming to my mind was back in the beginning, like the hippie days. And it was some kind of a Jesus people hippie kind of newsletter or magazine or something. And someone quoted, do not be conformed to this world, because the hippies were seeing themselves as nonconformists. Until, of course, there's nothing more conformative than being a hippie. I mean, when they started growing their hair long and wearing, rags and things like that, and which I did those things too. But I thought, we're not conforming to the world here. We're nonconformists. And then eventually the whole reason for doing it was conformity to the world. Of course, I do it for other reasons now. I'm not conforming to the world. I'm just being myself, which may or may not be okay. But the truth is, we think of conformity, at least some people think of conformity in terms of style, hairstyle, those kind of things, outward things like that. But the nonconformist that Paul's calling for is, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Start thinking differently. And you're going to stand out like a sore thumb if you do, because the world has a lot of opinions about sexuality that you're going to have to say, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. No, you're wrong on that one too. And and you're just going to be, the bad guy. You're going to be the bad guy in so many conversations. Let me real quickly, before we take a break, tell you some of the ways the world thinks about this that you're just not going to you're not going to be able to go along with. One, of course, is that we are products of evolution, products of nature, and therefore we're just animals. And like animals, alley cats go around and they have sex with whoever they want to. Well, there's no more reason for them to do that than for us to do that. We're supposed to, reproduce after our kind, and we're supposed to, spread our genes around and so forth. I mean, if we're animals, there's no basis for sexual morality. There might be a social basis. Someone might say, well, we're highly evolved animals, and we realize that society will fall apart if there's total promiscuity. There needs to be families, there needs to be some stability. Yeah, but that's not arguing morally. That's pragmatically. That's simply saying, society is a better place if people aren't all raping each other. But to say that it's transcendentally and morally wrong to do so, you can't make that argument if you're just an animal. There's no moral wrong with animals having sex with other animals. There's no marriage among them. Now, there are a few species that pair up for life. Storks and some others, I think, do that, but most animals don't. And why should we? Why should we bother with it? We're just animals. Well, we're not animals. That's just the point. All the animals were created first, and then God said, let's make man in our own image, in our likeness. This is not another animal. This is closer to another God. Now, we're not gods, of course, but we've got a part of us that's in the image of animals, and part of us that's in the image of God. And therefore, animals are not our role models. Sometimes the gay activists would say, well, you can see homosexual sex or same-sex activity in some of the species of animals. True. Not as a regular habit, but you do find examples of it. But they're not our role models. Animals are not our role models. And people who act like animals are not our role models. God is our role model. So this idea that we're just products of nature, it's natural for animals to do what they do, and so why shouldn't we? Well, we're going to have to stand against that. When people say the sex drive is just as much a natural and okay appetite as food is. Well, it's true, it's natural, but it's not the same. As I said, what you eat, well, you should do that to the glory of God too, but frankly, if you eat unhealthy food, you're not breaking any particular commandment of God. There's no moral stigma to eating things. There is a moral stigma associated with the sex. It's not on the same level with food appetite. The world thinks you can safely have sex outside of marriage. We now have birth control. We have antibiotics. We even have abortion. And therefore, the things that used to make it dangerous or risky to have sex out of marriage, they're not there anymore. STDs, we can usually take care of those with antibiotics. Pregnancies can be avoided or terminated. So you can have safe sex. Well, it depends. If the reason you are trying to avoid unsafe sex is because you're trying to avoid inconvenience, like having a baby that you didn't plan on, or being sick with a sexually transmitted disease, yeah, okay, there are certain inconveniences of sexual promiscuity that can be remedied or whatever if you don't have any conscience, but you can't become a virgin again. You can't become pure again. It's not safe to violate the law of God and think that it's not going to make its mark on your mind and on your heart and on your character. We are not stones that don't change. We are malleable souls that are shaped by the decisions we make, by guilt and by righteousness and by things like that. Sex is not just something that you want to avoid inconveniences that are a result of it. It's something where it's got a moral dimension that marks you and changes you. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to be sexually pure when you're a virgin than when you're a divorcee. Or maybe not a divorcee, maybe you've been involved sexually with someone before and you're now trying not to. It's a lot easier. I know because I was a virgin. I was a virgin when I got married the first time. And then I was a divorcee against my will. And I will tell you, life in that area has been much more difficult, much more challenging. And you'd think the teenage years are the most challenging. You know, that's when your hormones are just firing and you know, usually young men in their adolescent years are considered, that's the time when the sex drive is the strongest. Well, that might be true in some cases, but when you're a virgin, although you think about it and you have temptation, it's easier to kind of stay a virgin when you're already one. But once you've thrown that part away, even when you get old, when normally you might think, well, that's when the sex drive's not so strong, not so much testosterone there and so forth. Yeah, but it's still harder after having been one flesh with somebody than before. And when you do violate God's standards, you do harm to yourself. You change something about your character and your innocence. Remember Adam and Eve, it wasn't sex that they did, but when they sinned, they suddenly knew they were naked and wanted to hide. Before that, when they were innocent, they were naked and they were not ashamed. They had nothing to hide. It's when you've done something that marks your conscience, says you're not okay anymore. Suddenly, it alienates you from people. You want to hide. You don't want to show yourself. You don't want to be transparent. There's something different inside of you now. In that case, it was shame. And so there's no safe sex outside of God's boundaries. There are other dangers besides the physical ones that people often think about. There's a certain mentality that some people have that if you repress your sexual drive, let's just say you remain a eunuch or you remain a virgin or whatever, that you have to do psychological damage to yourself because that repressed sex drive is going to manifest itself in mental illness or whatever, you know. And this is, of course, just somebody talking who doesn't have much experience with it. Most people who say that are not virgins, and they don't know that it's not impossible to be mentally healthy and a virgin. Daniel was. Joseph eventually got married. Daniel never did, but Joseph, and by the way, Jeremiah never got married. Joseph in Egypt, he eventually got married, but not until he was an adult and had resisted sexual temptation under some very strong temptation and so forth. He was not mentally unbalanced because of repressing a sex drive. One might justify going wrong sexually on that basis, but it's not a real justification. No, living pure, whether you're a virgin or whether you're married and staying faithful to a spouse, or maybe you've been abandoned by a spouse or you're a widow or widower, staying pure will not be unhealthy. It'll be something you'll never regret. In fact, I will say that when you are on your deathbed looking back over your life, the things you are likely to regret most were indiscretions in that area if you had them. I don't know why, but sexual sin is different than other things. It has a different mark on the conscience. Anyone who is dying and they're thinking over their life and they have either been a virgin or they've been faithful to their spouse and they've been pure, they're going to die with an easier conscience than otherwise, I believe. And so the world, it gives us all kind of messages that aren't right. They say that gender is a social construct and that sexual morals are social constructs, and that's not true. God designed it. God designed it for a purpose. And if you use it for some purpose other than what God designed it for, there is damage that you probably cannot calculate. That will happen. It's like if someone invents a screwdriver for driving screws, but you use it to try to drill holes in 2x4s, it's not going to work well, and it's probably not going to be good for the tool eventually. It's not what it's made for. And so we know what sex is made for. Now, I want to talk, when we come back from a break, just about what I'd call spiritual warfare in this area. because it's very, very difficult, even in a society that isn't as promiscuous as ours and as deceived and gone so far afield as ours. It's very difficult just to fight your hormones, but then there's more than that. There's society, and there's pressure, and there's TV and internet and advertising and things like that. There's all kinds of things assaulting us. We're under a tremendous spiritual attack in this area. So I want to be able to talk a little bit about this spiritual warfare in the area before we're done. And we're going to have Q&A at the end, but we're going to take a break right now for, I'd say, 5 minutes, just so you can stretch, get something to drink. There's water out there. Go to the bathroom, and we'll start up again in about 5. Yes.
I promised.
All right, very good. We're back. We are back. Now it's you that need to be back. Okay, we will get started here. Okay, I want to talk about, the challenge we have and really what the resources are that God has given to us to be able to win this. Marilyn has some paper here. If you have questions and you want to submit them in writing anonymously instead of ask them, because there might be questions that you'd rather not ask out loud, feel free to write them down, and we'll take those during the Q&A time. I'll also be glad to take questions if you raise your hand during the Q&A time, but there may be times when you'd rather not identify yourself for whatever reason. So there's paper there. All right, so we've said that the world has a certain set of attitudes about sexuality, and this is an ever-changing attitude. But although it keeps changing, it's not going back and forth. It's going a certain direction. It's going from sanity to total insanity. To where, for the first time in all of history, there's a significant minority in the population who don't know what gender they are. There's always been a few intersex people who were born with ambiguous organs and even DNA. When I was in my 20s, I knew a young man, we'll call him. He was identified as a man, but he was born with ambiguous body parts, and they chose for him to be raised as a man. And he had a high voice. He had to take male hormones to prevent his breasts from growing and so forth. But he was a man, and he had the male parts too. It's just that there are a very, very small percentage of human beings born where it's not easy to tell what their gender is. But nowadays, people are saying, no one knows until the child gets old enough to tell you what their gender is. Doctors only guess. When they say you have a boy or you have a girl when they're at birth, they think, well, they're just making their best guess about it. You, when you're 3 or 4 years old, may prove them wrong by saying that you're something else. And every 3-year-old knows more than a doctor does about such things, I'm sure. And so this is how crazy our society has become. There's no society known to man that has ever been that crazy. There have been worse times. There's been more barbaric times. There's been times that were more cruel than our days. We have much more compassion for people than they did in the ancient world and so forth. We've got more humane laws. But though there have been worse times by many measures, there's never been times in all of history when the generality of the public was so infused with absolute stupidity about basic things that even a child knows, but grown-ups don't. Often you have to go to college to not know them. You have to, it takes a special kind of stupidity, obviously, for a society to think that it's ambiguous what gender most people are. But that's where our society is, and they're not getting better. The direction's going all in the wrong direction at the moment. And of course, as I was saying, people think of us as the bad guys because we're standing for biblical truth. And they might call you homophobic or something like that. But it's not that it's not that we single out same-sex activity or as a special target. Actually, we're not the ones who made that the focus. It arose as a focus, and we responded as society would have responded to it for centuries before. We're not really the innovators here. We're not the ones coming up with new ideas. Sexuality, homosexuality, it feels normal, I'm sure, to those who've known no other orientation all their lives. I'm not doubting there's people who have felt like same-sex attraction all their lives. But until I think it was the 60s or 70s, Even the secular, the atheistic psychiatric community listed homosexuality as a mental illness. And, societies in general saw it's not normal. But we're not even allowed to say that anymore. And the story of how that got removed from the list of mental illnesses, I've heard an extensive history of that on public radio once that was favorable toward that change. But it was, of course, a homosexual man in the psychiatric leadership community who lobbied for that change. And of course, now you're not supposed to say that being homosexual is even abnormal, even if you're not making a moral judgment. You may not be saying, oh, it's wrong to be a homosexual, if you just say it's not normal. That's not okay. More and more, society is simply moving from what everybody once knew to what no one will know unless Christians uphold the truth. Because once Christian voices are silenced on this area, there will be no one anymore that are holding out for reality. And so we need to speak the truth in love. And it's not that we are against homosexuality per se. It's what we are for. We're for establishing the biblical norms of sexuality because that's always going to be better for people. God has our well-being at interest. And he tells us what to do because he knows that if you do something else, it's not going to be good for you. And it's not going to be the way things were designed to be. That's just where it's at. So if we say homosexuality is not normal, we're not attacking homosexuality. We're saying there is a normal thing, and that's what we're for. All deviations from the norm are not normal. So sex between a man and a woman outside of marriage, that's not normal. That deviates from what God made sex for. A man having multiple wives, that's not normal. God didn't make it to be that way. A person having sex with somebody of the same sex, that's not normal. Not because we're singling these out to be particularly evil, it's just all a deviation from what's normal. And people will always do better, society will always do better if they know what's normal, especially about something as defining and motivating as a person's sexuality. Now, because the world is against us on this, we face a harder problem than we would have if we were living 100 years ago in America or in Western civilization. Because even 100 years ago, there were people, every Christian was tempted sexually. They had to fight against temptation. But the world was on their side for the most part. When I say the world, I mean society. Society agreed with them. Being faithful to your spouse is an important thing. Keeping marriages together, not having sex until you're married. Society agreed with that then, and it was still hard. Even if the whole world affirmed what Christianity teaches, it's still hard to be a Christian because it goes against our hormones, it goes against our biology, our biological urges, and so forth. But we have that exceptional thing, and I think it's a spiritual thing. I believe that our society has come under influence of demonic deception on this matter. And I don't say that just because that's a common Christian thing to say about anything that goes wrong, or that's the devil, but simply because it takes a special kind of demonic influence to make humans who are otherwise intelligent people as irrational as they have become. And when anyone who studies it can see that the increase of divorce, the breakdown of marriage, has destroyed society. The prisons are filled with violent criminals who almost none of them had a father in their home. Well, how did they get born? Well, obviously they were born out of wedlock, or if their parents were married, they didn't stay together, and they were not raised with a father in home. People who do prison ministries have told me they've never met a person in prison who was raised with a father in the home. I'm not saying a person who was raised with a father in the home will never end up in prison. It just doesn't seem to happen that way very often. Not often enough to be a statistic, anyway. Because of the breakdown in marriage, we have more crime. We have more lives ruined. There are other kinds of crimes that aren't related to sexual crimes or even violent crimes, which many kids would not do if they have dad engaged in the home, knowing that if I do that, my dad would kill me. You know, people used to say that when they had dads. Families that had dads, you'd often hear kids say, "I can't do that. My dad would kill me." Now, of course, their dad wouldn't kill them, but they knew their dad would not have anything to do with it, them doing that thing. There'd be consequences. But there's no dad now in many of the homes. And obviously, society's destroyed. Now, that's obvious. For example, the people who are running Chicago, they know that that place is overrun with crime, and there's murders in the city of Chicago every weekend that are about equal to the rest of the country combined. You know, they talk, we got an epidemic of violent crime against homosexuals. Actually, there aren't really very many violent crimes against homosexuals on the basis of them being homosexuals. Sometimes a target of crime happens to be homosexual, but not, you know, it's not aimed at them for that reason. Very few crimes have ever been aimed at homosexuals. But I don't think they need to talk about that until they can talk about the crimes that aren't against homosexuals, which are being committed all the time in great numbers. If you take up the total number of crimes against homosexuals in a year, I think I heard the statistic was like I think there were 18, or, you know, in one of these recent years, last year or the year before, I think 18 hate crimes against homosexuals. There's more murders in Chicago on a weekend. And so we can see that our society is broken. And Chicago, frankly, that crime statistic is caused largely by young black men killing other young black men or women or children or whatever. It's mostly young black men. And this is not a racial statement. It's a social statement, because 70 or 80% of black children in America are born without a father in the home and are raised without a father. Now, among other races, it's high too. It's like 40% or something like that. It's very high in general, but sadly, among black youth, it's a very high percentage, and it's like over 3/4. And no surprise, half at least of the prison population is black youth too. Not because blacks are worse people, but they are victimized by the sexual revolution. It used to be, frankly, the black people in the country that had more stable marriages than white people. Do you know that? Blacks in this country used to be more religious per capita than whites. I don't know when that changed or why it changed, but the divorce rate was low among the black community at one time in the society, and it switched over. I think it had a lot to do with social programs that incentivized women to have kids outside marriage for welfare or whatever. I mean, you're not supposed to say that, because you're not allowed to say true things. But there is a cause and effect relationship to those things, which a thinking person would see, but they're not allowed to. And where people who are otherwise intelligent can't see the most obvious things, and when it gets to the point where they can't even tell, is someone a boy or a girl, it shows that takes more than human stupidity. That takes almost demonically imposed blindness. And I believe that Satan has launched perhaps an unprecedented campaign of deception on our society, and this whole sexual area is an area where all the boundaries are being eroded by this thing. And so it is a spiritual warfare we're involved in. Now, of course, one of the problems is that the enemy has an ally in each of us called our flesh. It'd be one thing if the ally was only the enemy was only on the outside, and we could just get together and say, okay, he's not going to get anywhere near me. The trouble is there's someone in me that likes him too. There's the fallen flesh. That's what Paul said. Paul said in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 17, the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. These two are contrary to one another, so that you do not do what you want to do. That's a problem. The lust of the flesh, he lists in that same chapter. Many of them are sexual things, not all of them, but a great number of the things in the list have to do with sexual deviancy and sexual misbehavior. And he says, those who do these things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But he said, the fruit of the Spirit, he gives other traits that are different than that. And it's a spiritual thing. The flesh, unfortunately, is often on the side of the enemy. In fact, Peter says in 1 Peter 2:11, "Beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, resist fleshly lusts that war against the soul." Your fleshly lusts war against the soul. So you've got a war that's inside of you besides the war that's coming at you from outside. You got both going on. And Paul, of course, his answer to that in Galatians 5:16 is walk in the Spirit and you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. If you walk in the Spirit, you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. Well, obviously, we have to ask, how do you do that? And we will talk about that. But that's the answer. The power of the Spirit of God is given to us to win the spiritual war. We cannot resist spiritual enemies successfully in the flesh. We need supernatural spiritual aid, and we have it, at least available. Now we have to understand when people fall sexually, it didn't just happen suddenly in most cases. It's not the first compromise they made. When Jesus said, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you're already involved in this situation in your heart. You might not even ever do it physically, but if you do it physically, it's because you did it in your heart first. The compromise starts inside. The compromise begins where you're not noticing it, perhaps. You're making, you're just slipping a little bit here and a little bit there, and eventually, before you know it, you've fallen and you say, I can't believe I did that. How'd that ever happen? Well, it's usually because compromises have been made, looking at things, watching things. I have to say, I've never willingly looked at pornography, but I watch television. I don't watch it as much as some people do. I usually watch a little bit of it every week, and mostly I watch the news, and that's mostly not pornographic. But anytime I've watched a movie or a modern TV show, it's got stuff in it that used to be called pornography. And, I have to a lot of times I just have to turn it off or leave the room or whatever. Sometimes I just close my eyes and wait for that part to go by because I'm interested in how the plot's going to end. And the plot isn't about that. They just stick that in there to spice it up and draw audience. But we see things when we don't go looking for them. They present themselves to us. And that's true if you're driving down the street and there's billboards advertising stuff. We don't see as many billboards these days as when I was younger. I think city planners and stuff like that have thought they're ugly, and you don't see as much of that clutter. But I used to drive to a Bible study when I was young every week that I was teaching, and there was a certain part on the freeway drive that had a suntan product, suntan lotion product on it, and it always had some kind of a very uncovered female body on it. And for some reason, they never chose unattractive women for these signs. And I was an unmarried 19 or 20-year-old. And I remember that was a distraction to me that I didn't like. And I remember thinking, okay, every week when I come by here, I'm going to have to look at the other side of the road when I get between these two off-ramps. I'm going to have to look over here away so I don't see the sign. And lo and behold, as soon as I started doing that, they put up a sign on the other side of the road around the same spot that had similar objectionable subject matter. But you can't escape it entirely. You're going to be exposed to it in the world. So you have to be able to beat it and not just try to avoid it. Now, you should avoid it when you can. When Potiphar's wife was trying to lure Joseph, he really couldn't avoid her very often. He was a slave in the house. She was the master's wife. He had to be in the house. He couldn't say, I'm quitting this job. I'm going to go find a job where the mistress isn't trying to seduce me all the time. He was stuck there. If he ran away, he'd be hunted down and arrested and whatever. So he just had to try to resist. And it got really hard. At one point, she actually physically grabbed him and tried to throw him in bed. And he ran away and left his cloak behind him. And he went to jail for that because she accused him of something he didn't do. And yet here's a guy, 17 years old he was at that time. And far from any fellowship. His whole family was in another country. He was in a pagan land. He probably could have gotten away with something, but he said, to her, how can I do this thing and sin against God, was his answer to her. How can I sin against God like this? And this is the way that a man defeats spiritual attack, if he defeats it all. It's through the fear of God. Proverbs says, by the fear of God, men depart from evil. When Solomon is talking to his son about avoiding sexual temptation, he says, because the eyes of the Lord are running to and fro and seen in every place. In other words, you're being watched. Don't do anything you wouldn't want God to see, because he's going to see it. And the fear of God, if you be in the fear of God all the day long, like the Bible says, it will change everything about the nature of temptation, because you'll fear the temptation rather than toy with it. Toying with temptation is the scary thing to do. It says in Proverbs that the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Not because you're a hater, but because you hate evil like you hate cancer in your child. It's something that's destructive and deadly. And the fear of the Lord causes you to not seek entertainment in evil, not expose yourself to temptation toward evil any more than you have to. There's limits. Again, Joseph couldn't leave the house, so he was stuck, but he had to resist anyway. Some of us are in much harder situations than others. I have a friend in prison. He's innocent. He's an innocent man, but because he wouldn't take a plea bargain and say he was guilty, he was sentenced to 28 years in prison. He was in prison for many years in Southern California. We used to visit him. He was just moved to San Quentin last week. And last night I heard he was put in with a cellmate who was going to force him to have sex with him. And he wouldn't, so the man stabbed him and almost killed him. He's in the hospital in the prison. Now here's a guy who can't get away. Someone is saying, have sex with me or I'll kill you. Now, Potiphar's wife didn't threaten to kill Joseph. I think he still would have retained his integrity even if she did, but that wasn't that. Here's a guy in prison. He's going to be there another 10 years anyway, and he's in a cell with somebody who wants to kill him if he doesn't submit. Where's he going to go? Well, I don't know. I've been praying desperately for the last 24 hours since I heard he was put in the hospital because of this attack. But it's hard to believe. It's just hard to believe that Christians, he is a Christian, can sometimes be in such hard situations where the temptation, he doesn't have any interest in having sex with a guy. Obviously, it's not temptation in that way, but more like intimidation, We live in a world where some of us are in situations where you really can't totally get away from those things that would pressure you to compromise. But we do have to fear God. If you fear God more than you fear man, in this case, he has to fear God more than he fears dying, because he almost did die. And there's no reason to believe he won't next time, if there's a next time. I mean, he's a Christian man, innocent Christian man in a prison, San Quentin, and he has to every day think, maybe I'll die today because, the people want to kill me. Which I could get out of that if I just kind of pleasure them, but I'm not going to do that. Thank God we're not in that situation, but we might be in situations much less than that. And some of us may even succumb to temptation that is much less than that, which is shame on us. But if so, it's only because we don't fear God enough. We don't make God's pleasure and God's approval the highest priority, which is what fearing God means. We need to recognize that things that are illicit, that is, things that are forbidden, hold a special appeal to our fallen nature. The prostitute in the book of Proverbs, as she's giving her pitch to the guy that's being described, she says to him in chapter 7 of Proverbs, stolen water is sweet, and that which is done in secret is pleasant. Now, stolen water is sweet. That's obviously a proverbial statement. It just, water, if you steal it, you're doing something wrong. It's not yours, but it's all the sweeter because you feel like you're getting away with something, Well, water that you steal, it probably tastes the same as water that you got legitimately, but there's a certain special attraction to that which is, you feel like you're getting away with something. It's in that rebellious, fallen sinfulness in our nature that we need to be aware of that. We need to recognize that the things that we're tempted by, part of the temptation, part of its strength is that we know it's a wrong thing to do. And there's a little part of us that's on the enemy's side and says, I'm kind of attracted to doing wrong things. Kind of want to be a bad person once in a while. Now, Christians who fear God don't want to. And so the fear of God is an extremely indispensable aspect of defeating this. Now, the most vulnerable times, we need to be aware that illicit things are going to hold a special attraction to us, our carnal nature. But there are times more than others that this particular temptation to violate sexual norms is going to be stronger than other times. And one of those times, of course, when you're lonely. And I should make this clear. You can be a very lonely married person. You know, some people say, I'm lonely because I'm single. I can't find a husband or a wife. Well, that can be lonely indeed, but you can be married and be lonely. I know that. And many people know that. Marriage doesn't end loneliness automatically. It can be a great amelioration of loneliness when it's as it should be, but many marriages are not as they should be, and it's not really any less lonely being in it than out of it. But a person who's lonely always is going to be tempted to relieve that loneliness with intimacy. And sexual intimacy is a very strong draw in a case like that. You know, in Genesis 38, Judah, who was a pretty good guy in the Bible, he was one of the better sons of Jacob. He's the one who shines as more virtuous than the others in the story of Joseph and so forth. Yet when it says his wife died, in chapter 30 of Genesis, his wife died, and shortly after that, he was on his way to shear his sheep, and there was a prostitute by the road. Actually, he didn't know it was his daughter-in-law. He didn't know that. That's a complex story. But the point is, he turned into her. He went in and did his thing with what he thought was just a prostitute. Now, there's no suggestion that he was one who regularly visited prostitutes. He was a generally good guy. But it says his wife had died. He was now suddenly a widower. We can assume he was lonely, and he was vulnerable. Shouldn't have been, should have resisted it. It actually became an embarrassment to him because it was found out, and something that he should have been more resistant to. But when you are lonely, that's when one of the times that you're particularly vulnerable. And I will say this, when I was a young man and single, I remember times, now see, I made a point of living with other people. I never actually lived alone by choice. When I was not married, I lived with other men, a house full of men. We lived in Christian houses where we had Bible studies and outreach from the house and stuff. And so I was living with other Christian men, maybe it might have been 4 or 5 in a house. And so at times when I was alone and feeling lonely and tempted, a lot of times I would find out there's someone else, one of the other guys are in the living room. I go sit down and we just start talking about things, just fellowship, not about sexual temptation, just talk about anything. And I found out that talking about anything, just connecting with another human being socially, actually reduced the sexual temptation. When that conversation was over, I realized I'm not thinking about that anymore. You know, I mean, because it was not really a sexual thing as much as it was a lonely thing. And when you're lonely, of course, sexual temptation makes an appeal that's more appealing. But if you can connect with other people in a totally non-sexual way, and you know, in a way that gets below the surface of just the weather and stuff, that you actually relate with somebody about things, especially if you talk about the things of God, it's amazing how that seemingly obsessive, sexual thing, it really fixes it. It definitely fixes it. I was just listening to a book on an audio book about church history today, and it was talking about Jerome. Jerome, back in the 5th century or 4th century, was a monk. And it said that he struggled with strong sexual temptation, and monks are celibate. They don't have sex. They don't get married. And it says that he found his power over that largely by his studies. He became a great scholar. He translated the Bible from Greek into Latin, and that's the Vulgate. And he wrote a lot of books and stuff. But I just thought it was interesting listening to it. So that he was, he was assailed by great sexual temptations by his own testimony, but he defeated them simply by redirecting his thoughts toward his studies. Or so by redirecting your thoughts toward another conversation with somebody about something else, connecting with people, or redirecting, it can be done. And that's something that I'm not saying that's the spiritual way to handle it, because even a non-spiritual person can probably manage their sex drive somewhat with those activities, but it's wisdom. It's just something that is someone might not think to do. They just think, oh, I've got no choice but to succumb. Because the devil always wants to tell you, this temptation is not going to let up until you succumb to it. When you succumb, you'll be glad you did. You can always repent. That's one of the chief lies of the devil. When you're under strong temptation and it's not going away very fast, you start thinking, man, how do I get rid of this? And the suggestion comes, and you know who makes it. Yeah, you just do it. I mean, God's gracious. You can repent. You'll be forgiven. This is not going to go away until you do it. That's not true. It will go away. And a lot of times when it begins to seem like I've got to give in and I've got to give in, it becomes more obsessive. It's probably because the devil knows that he's going to have to pull back soon, because God's the one who allows the devil access to you to test you. And he determines how long and how far Satan could go in testing Job. Remember, every time Satan had to ask God for permission to test Job, and God said, you can do this, but you can't do more than that. You can go this much further, but you can't do that. Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, and he didn't know how long it was going to be, but the devil was hitting him pretty hard with some pretty major temptations there, and Jesus just resisted. And then it says, and then the devil left him for a while. It's like, okay, the moment before the devil left, Jesus probably had no idea that this temptation was about ready to end. All he knew was he's under intense temptation, and he's got to hold out against it, and he did. But sometimes the very moment you would have given up, it's the time that God's going to say, okay, devil, draw back. You can't do this anymore. Because God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted above what you're able to endure. With the temptation, will give you a way of escape. And that way of escape is not succumbing to it. That way of escape is that you stand firm in your faith, and it's a sensible thing to distract yourself from those thoughts if you can, especially if you can have a fruitful or spiritually edifying conversation or read an edifying book and just get your thoughts on something else. It's just because you're lonely in many cases. And it's amazing, as soon as there's no loneliness at the moment, that temptation seems to be gone too. Not maybe every time, but it worked for me. Another time that the Bible says you might be particularly vulnerable to sexual temptation is when you're married and your spouse is sexually unavailable. Now, this can be because your spouse doesn't like you, or just doesn't have as strong a sex drive as you do, or it might be because they're sick in some way. There are various ways in which a spouse simply may not be sexually available at times. And Paul, when he talks to married couples in 1 Corinthians 7, he tells them not to deprive each other sexually. He says, lest your partner succumb to the temptation of the devil. He says that in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5, that he says, if you don't engage in normal sexual activity as a married couple, if you're the one who's preventing it, if you're withholding it, then you're tempting your partner. Now, he doesn't say, and they are justified then if they go out and cheat. No, there's no justification. You're just making it harder for them not to. We're not supposed to stumble our brother. I'll tell you a personal story. My ex-wife, before she left me, I won't tell you which one because I've had more than one, but she was talking to a girlfriend of hers and saying, I'm going to leave. And I'm telling Steve, I'm just going to leave for 6 months. I'm going to say I'm going to leave him for 6 months to work on reconciliation. But she says, I don't have any interest in reconciliation. I'm just doing that thinking that maybe 6 months will be long enough to get him to cheat. And then I'll have an excuse to commit adultery. But if he doesn't in 6 months, I can make it a year. I can make it 2 years. She's saying, I'm just going to do what I can to get him to fall so that I can justify leaving. Now, I never did fall. She divorced me anyway. She decided she didn't need the justification after all. But the point here was, when I heard that, I thought, that's exactly the opposite of what Paul said to do. Paul said, wives and husbands, do not do what will tempt your partner to fall. And here is an actual plot to try to get a partner to fall, which is totally, I couldn't understand that at all. But she had other issues, mental issues too at the time. So I don't hold it against her completely, but it certainly was surprising. The other time that's particularly a vulnerable time is when you're angry with your spouse. Or maybe you're angry at God. If you're a single person, you get angry at God. Or if you're a married person, you get angry at your spouse. Because sometimes going out and doing something wrong in that area is kind of a way of wanting to punish your spouse. Now, I'm not saying everyone who gets mad at their spouse would go out and cheat, but those who are inclined to cheat are more inclined to do so when they feel like, yeah, my spouse deserves for me to do this to them, I would think, I've never cheated on a wife, but I would imagine that it'd be awfully hard to do so unless I could pretend that, they deserve it. Because when you have a faithful spouse, you know that, well, they don't deserve for me to do this. But if you can convince yourself they do deserve it because they've done something very offensive to you, well, then that can change the way you look at it and make you more susceptible to temptation. But I want to make it very clear, a couple of those situations are related to married people. Obviously, Paul said that marriage is a desirable thing in more than one way, but one of the ways is to help a person manage their sexual temptation. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, 1 and 2, he said, about the things you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, but to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every wife have her own husband. So basically he said, if you can stay single and pure, excellent. But frankly, if the temptation is too great, then I think being married is a good idea. And it is. And also, of course, he said, if you can stay single, be good. But if you can't control yourself, he said a few verses later, get married because it's better to marry than to burn. We know that verse. And by burn, I believe he means to burn with unfulfillable desire and to be continually doing it. It is hard, if you don't feel you have the gift of singleness. Now, Paul did say some are given one gift and some another, and Jesus said that too. Jesus said, after he told in Matthew 19 about, divorce is not okay, his disciples said, well, if that's true, then it's better not to get married. And Jesus answered, yeah, not everyone can receive that statement, he said. Now, he's saying, you're right, but that's not something everyone can do. Yeah, there's a sense in which not getting married is a lot better if you can do that. But if you can't do that, then you better get married. And he said, not everyone can receive that. Same thing, Solomon said to his son in chapter 5 of Proverbs. He's telling about avoiding fornication. He says, why would you let your rivers and fountains of water be scattered in the streets? Again, he's using the illustration of a force of nature that's not being restrained as it should be, and in this case, a metaphor for sex. He says, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. Let her body gratify you. Let her body satisfy you, is what he says. So, the Bible does teach both in the Old and the New Testament that certainly marriage, in addition to having other valuable uses, is is one of the gifts God has given to people to help them to regulate their sex drive. But on the other hand, as I said a moment ago, marriage alone is not the answer. It may be the answer for some people. When you marry well and wisely, and you've got a warm wife or husband, and the marriage is a happy one, then there's a very good chance you'll experience very little temptation outside the marriage. I will say this, I've been married for 12 years. Dana and I just had our 12th anniversary, and I've been amazed how free from sexual temptation the past 12 years have been. Now you might say, now, see, that's because you're an old man. Now that doesn't always guarantee anything. There can be dirty old men too. But the truth is, when I was single, I didn't find purity an easy thing. It was a struggle. When I was married unhappily to wives who were not following the Lord much, even though they said they would, that was hard too. But I'm in a happy marriage now, and frankly, it's amazing how that is God's gift of relief in that situation. But not everyone has that, and I didn't either. Being married earlier in my life, it was not the solution, because you can have more frustration in marriage than as a single person. Again, if there's things not right in your relationship with your spouse. So don't think, well, I just need to get married so that I can get over this sexual struggle. Well, it's good that you're looking for taking whatever measures necessary to get over your sexual struggle. Just so you know, hastily getting married is not a good answer. Because if you marry unwisely, you may find yourself struggling more, and now you're in a situation you weren't when you're single, and that is one you can't change. Once you're married, you can't just leave it. When you're single, you don't necessarily have to stay single. You've got options. When you marry foolishly, you don't have the same options. You're in it. It's like Joseph in the house of Potiphar. He can't go anywhere. He's got to be there. And, you just be wise. If you're going to get married, don't just rush into marriage because you think, oh, this will solve my sexual temptation problems. Well, it could, if it's a wise choice. But you can't just assume it's a wise choice unless you've done some wise vetting. We have some friends, Christian friends, who got married very hastily against our counsel. And they've had very, very unhappy marriages. And it's not that they were doomed to. In both cases, or three, there's several cases we know, Christians who were good Christians married other good Christians. They weren't very well matched, and I guess in some ways they weren't quite as good Christians as they appeared to be, but the truth is, all of them are still together, but we hear from them a lot. But in each case, they came to us for counsel. We said, hey, listen, this may be a good one or not, but don't do it now. Don't do it so quickly. You don't know enough about this person yet. Be patient. Find out, because I would say this. My failed marriage didn't occur because I didn't marry a Christian. I married somebody that had been a missionary and was still evangelistic and read the Bible all the time, but happened to be kind of a unstable person, which I didn't learn that quickly enough. What I knew is she was a woman who had shown some real dedication to the Lord, seemed like a very safe bet. It seemed like it came together, the Lord kind of put it together, but it was hasty. I mean, we got married more hastily than if I'd waited a year, I don't think we would have gotten married, because I would have seen some of those things. So I'm just saying, just because someone's a Christian doesn't mean they're going to be a good mate. You got to be patient. Even if God's going to give you a good marriage to be part of your deliverance from the struggle, you better make sure you wait long enough and know enough to know that it's going to be a good one, because a bad one is not going to fix things at all. And if you marry foolishly, oh man, here's some of the things that go wrong there, as you probably know. First of all, you might marry someone who becomes an abusive spouse. That's awful. A lot better to be single than to go into an abusive marriage. You might be married to someone who's going to be an unfaithful spouse. And you might say, well, then I can just divorce them. Just divorce? Yeah, well, maybe you can divorce them and be innocent of it, but there's no such thing as just getting divorced. Divorce is the most disruptive thing in a human's life, in a family's life. I mean, you might get out of the marriage and have your integrity intact because your spouse cheated, but it's not just a divorce. It's going to be the most painful, destructive thing to you and all the people in your family that could possibly happen. And many people, not very many, but some people, myself was one of them, chose to stay in a marriage with an unfaithful wife because, frankly, divorce is worse than living with an unfaithful wife. At least that was my judgment. Rather be faithful myself. A spouse can be cold and aloof. Like I said, they can be sexually unresponsive or unavailable. And that may not be their fault. It may be that they've got health issues and they're unavailable for that reason. But, things aren't perfect just because you're married. A spouse may actually end up being kind of violent to the children or a bad example to children. That's something you don't want to end up with if you can avoid it. And I have to say, it's not easy to find a good spouse. Solomon indicated that a virtuous woman is as valuable as a ruby. Now, what makes a ruby valuable is you don't find many of them. If there were a lot of them, they wouldn't be very valuable. They'd be like agates, Gemstones are valuable not because of their usefulness in most cases, but because of their rarity. And when Solomon said, who can find a virtuous wife? Her cost is above rubies. What he's saying is, it's as hard to find one as to find rubies. They're very rare and therefore very valuable. Now, it's not just the wife. Solomon also said about men, he says, most men will proclaim every man his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find? So he says, who can find a good woman? Who can find a good man? And I'll tell you, that's what I hear so much from single people who are, on the market for marriage. Women say, Christian women say, you just can't find any good Christian men anymore. And men say, I can't find any godly women anymore. And I believe them. Godly people are hard to find, men and women. But that makes it all the more important that you don't rush into anything because because everyone wants to appear to be a godly one when they want to marry a Christian. And you don't find out if they're really godly until you see them go through some of the tests of life, and that takes a while. You need to get to know somebody. And I suggest you get to know them in a non-romantic setting. In our society, you approach marriage, generally speaking, by dating. They didn't do that in biblical times. And I'm not saying we have to do everything the way they did in biblical times. The things the Bible commands, we have to do. The things they did because it was just cultural, we don't have to do that. But sometimes things societies did for centuries that were cultural, there was some wisdom behind them. It may not be a moral imperative, but there's wisdom in it. What we have almost always is people will meet somebody they find attractive, and they'll say, I think I'd maybe like to find out if this person would be a good partner. There aren't as many people talking about getting married as there used to be. I think the younger, Gen Zers are a lot of times not even thinking about getting married, but morally minded people, generally speaking, except in rare cases, they're interested in marriage. And so how do you do that? Well, you date some people. That's how you test them out. It's like getting, like you want to hire someone, you get a few people to come to job interviews and you interview them and find out if they're the right one. Well, but dating isn't just like a job interview. Dating in our society already has a romantic component built in, unless you're not calling it dating. If you're calling it dating, the idea is, I'm lonely tonight, I'd like to be in someone's arms, maybe this is a good person to be with. You might even be saying, I'm not going to sexually compromise or anything like that, but there's still this idea of maybe there's hope for romance here. Maybe this person would be the one. And dating, whether you're a moral Christian person or just a pagan but who's interested in marriage, it's usually you're trying out several prospects several interviewees, but you're not just interviewing them to get to know them. You're having a trial romance with them. It might only be a single date. And you might think, I'm not sure there'll be a second date, but I want to find out if there's chemistry here. And the idea of a date usually is to see if there's chemistry and hope that there is. And sometimes a little bit is generated, but not enough to make it a good match long term. And a lot of people say, well, people should date a lot because dating one person after another, that's just like that's practice for marriage. No, that's practice for divorce. Learning to get romantically interested in someone and then break up with them, and they get romantically interested in someone else and break up with them, that's not the way our psyche was made to be. That's not the way ancient societies did it. And I'm not saying we have to do it the way they did it, but I think they knew something that we don't. Frankly, they knew a lot of things we don't. But we have to realize that when God made Adam and Eve, he made them psychologically and morally to ideally only have one romantic relationship in a lifetime. You can live with several past romantic relationships. You might even keep rather morally clean, having had many, but you don't remain psychologically unchanged. Because when you start to give your heart to somebody, and it's not just friends getting to know each other just because they have some, they both like football or something, or they like the same music, but someone who you're trying to kind of make a connection with, you start sharing stuff about yourself that not everyone knows. You're trying to get, in not a non-literal sense, kind of under their skin and see how much there is there besides physical attraction and things like that. And you're trying to impress them too, and they're trying to impress you. And there's this dynamic where you're trying to build something, even if only briefly, to see if sparks fly, to see if there's a romantic prospect here. And you get those juices going, and then you say, no, this isn't the one. I'm not going to see them here. Let's find someone else. And you do the same with someone else. Our psyche was not made to flourish with a whole bunch of people that you've given that much of yourself to, and then tried to get it back. The truth is, anyone who's been in a relationship, let's say they had marriage in mind, they dated someone, let's say they dated for a year or two, and then they break up. Many times, what I hear them say is, I gave them so much of my personal life, just in the couple of years we were dating. I mean, they know everything. They know my secrets. There's tremendous intimacy there, and they took it with them. Now, if you had several of those before you get married, you got bits of yourself spread out all over the place. Different people who shared that with you are now somewhere else. You may think about them in the future. Even when you're married to someone else, you might remember them. In fact, you might compare them favorably against the person you married. I don't know if, I'm not offended by this kind of joke, but some people are. I heard a joke about two old people sitting on a park bench, and all of a sudden, she just reached over and slapped her husband, knocked him off the bench. Shook himself off, got back on the bench, said, "What was that for?" And she said, "That's for 50 years of bad sex." And he was silent for a minute, then he slapped her off the bench, and she said, "What was that for?" He said, "That's for knowing the difference." Back when people didn't date and get romantic with other people until it was the person they're going to marry, they didn't compare their spouse with others. Not in the sense that people do who've had many romantic relationships. They don't know the difference, and it's just as well. People function best if they get one romantic partner and get to keep that one for life. That's what God made Adam and Eve for. I'm not saying nothing else will work, because since the fall, things happen. People die. A spouse dies. There's nothing wrong with a person having a second marriage. Sometimes a divorce takes place in which the innocent party may remarry. That person then has more than one in their lifetime. But it's not ideal. It's not the way God thought would be the best thing. And if people didn't die or sin, there'd be no divorce and there'd be no widowhood. And the first person you married would be who you're always with, until one of you dies, but you wouldn't die. Our nature was made to do best in one lifelong connection between two becoming one flesh. And dating somewhat compromises it. I'm not saying that dating always ends up in sin. And sometimes people don't know any other way to do it. But it's true that if you have a dating mentality, usually it means I'm dating this person, and maybe something will develop into marriage. That'd be great, but maybe not. If not, I'm ready to go on and try someone else. This is a temporary romance. It might be permanent someday, but at the moment, it's temporary. And therefore, if we end up broken up, well, we knew that could happen. We never were committed for life after all. We were just trying each other out. And trying someone out, in many cases, means you're playing with their emotions. You might say, no, I'm coming into this eyes wide open, this may not work out, but maybe they're not. You might say, well, I'm not getting too involved, but maybe they are. You don't know what's happening to them. Getting involved romantically with someone, it's your emotions and theirs that are involved, and if it doesn't stay together, somebody usually gets hurt. I mean, maybe once in a while, someone doesn't. Maybe once in a while they both say, yeah, it's been fun, but I think we're not right for each other. Let's just break up. I'm sure that happens sometimes. But more often than not, breakups, someone gets hurt. They say, well, what's wrong with being hurt? We're in a world, we had man up. Get some thick skin. Getting hurt's inevitable. It is inevitable. We will get hurt. But it's not inevitable that we have to hurt others. You see, if I'm not here when I'm thinking about how am I relating to this woman. I'm a single man, let's say, and I'm relating with a woman. I'm trying to say, in my mind, maybe there's some hope for something here, but how much do I want to encourage that before I have a good reason to believe there's hope for something? Because I might be interested enough to get her interested, but if she gets really interested and I get uninterested, then I'm going to hurt her. And, I could just say, well, that's her fault. She got involved. No, if I encourage that, I've hurt her. As a Christian, I don't want to hurt anybody. So the thing is, dating is not ideal. They say breaking up is hard to do, but it gets easier with practice. Now, divorce is breaking up a romantic relationship. But so is much dating. Dating is you get involved romantically, then you break up. Do it again, you break up. Eventually, it gets easier to break up. It just becomes something that you're accustomed to. Then you get married, and it's not so hard to break up that either, because that's kind of the way all your relationships have been. You've developed a habit of breaking up, and it does get easier with practice. So, dating, we have to be very careful at it. Now, some people say we should have courtship instead. Maybe so. What I would just say is that I don't think anyone should be dating somebody unless they're thinking that that person is hopefully a prospect. Now, you may find out, and you may realize that you may find out that there's something you didn't see early on that makes not a good prospect. In which case, you'll be happy if you didn't get too deeply emotionally involved, and they didn't get too deeply emotionally involved. I'll tell you, one of the best situations I had, my wife who died, we were only married 6 months and she was killed in an accident, but we had a wonderful marriage for those 6 months, and she was a wonderful woman, but I proposed to her on our first date. Actually, I intended to on our first date. I got chicken and didn't do it till our second date. But we didn't have our first date until we'd become really good friends in a situation where there were a lot of guys and a lot of girls hanging out together, Christians. When I say a lot, there were like 4 or 5 single guys and maybe a similar number of single girls. They weren't paired up, just friends. We were in Southern California. We went to the beach together, went to Calvary Chapel together. After church, we go out to the restaurant together and talk about the Bible together. There was no romance there. And it was in that context, over a period of many months, I thought, this woman here really has something about her. She really, she's a strong Christian. She's a sensible woman. She's attractive. She's not as attractive as some of the women I've known, but plenty enough. Certainly the strong points that certainly would overrule any defects in that area, and she wasn't bad looking at all. But I remember just getting to know her that way in that context where I didn't know if she liked me, she didn't know if I liked her, and what happened? I've told this before, but not very often. I had a dream one night. And in the dream, I was, our group of men and women that were close friends were at the beach together. And I saw her walking on the beach holding hands with a guy that I didn't recognize. I said to one of her friends, "Oh, I didn't know that she had a boyfriend." And he said, "Well, she didn't. She was waiting for you to ask her, but you didn't, so she's now with him." And I remember waking up in a cold sweat. I didn't realize how much that would bother me. Yeah, we were just friends. But when I had a dream and she ended up with someone else, I realized that that was not okay for me. We hadn't gotten romantically involved, but I knew that she was a thing of value that I'd feel a tremendous loss if someone else got her instead of me. And so that's why I went to her, knowing her very well already, and I told her, I actually ended up proposing. I won't go into the details about that. And she said yes. So it was our second date, but we'd never held hands, never had any romantic buildup of any kind in the relationship. Now, you can't always do that, perhaps. It's not that easy to have those situations. I'm just saying that was an ideal situation. I'm not saying people should always do that. I'm saying if they can, that's a better way to do things. You can't always, not everyone's going to have the same circumstances. There's going to be some people you'll never get to know them at all unless it's on what we call a date, probably, just because there'll be no situation in which you're going to be together with them, getting to know them, except if you ask them out, Now, of course, if that's what you do, it's still very important that you be careful what you do on that date. Because, frankly, most Christians know that it's wrong to use consciousness-altering chemicals, but hormones are consciousness-altering chemicals, too. And when you stir up those hormones, you're altering your consciousness and sometimes losing objectivity. And so it's very important to think when you're with somebody and you don't have a very, very good reason to believe this is the one that God's going to have me with, that you can keep, in a sense, the relationship going, but make it very clear, I'm going to be very cautious here about getting romantically interested. I feel like there's a possibility of that, but I don't know. And so I don't want to give that impression. And what do you do? Do you touch? Well, I wouldn't want to do something that's going to get those hormones going, because then I'm fighting against consciousness-altering drugs that I've invited into my own head. And I remember hearing about a boy who's gone on his first date, a Christian boy, and he's with his dad, a Christian dad, and saying, "Dad, I'm a little nervous. I'm not really sure what to do on the date." And his father said, "Well, I thought you're going to go out to like a movie and you're going to have dinner together." And the son said, yeah, of course, that's what we're going to do, but I mean what we should do. And his father said, "Oh, I get it. I see what you're asking." He said, "Well, let me ask you this. Do you think you're going to marry this girl?" And the son said, "I have no idea. This is the first time I'm getting to go out with her. I don't know. So you might not marry her. Do you think she'll marry somebody other than you someday?" And the son said, "Well, of course, I have no idea, but it's entirely possible." And he said, "Well, suppose she does marry somebody. Now, do you think you might marry somebody and not her, but someday marry someone else?" He said, "Of course, those possibilities are true. They could be." He says, "Well, if somebody is taking your future wife out tonight, what would you want him to do with her tonight?" That's what you should do with this girl, and nothing more. You do unto others as you would want done to you. When you're out with somebody who you might have a romantic interest in, but you don't know that you're going to marry them, realize that you might actually be going to marry someone someday, and they may be out tonight too with somebody else. What do you want that person to do with your future spouse? Well, let that be the guide of what you should do with the person you're out with. Don't want to get them too interested to the point where they would get hurt if you break up. And you don't want, this is not simply talking about morality. This is talking about loving your neighbors, you love yourself. And I think that's the hardest thing to do for single people when they're out with somebody they find attractive. Lust is a very powerful thing, and it sometimes will overrule love. But love means I'm not going to do anything that could potentially hurt this person if I can avoid it, or that I would not want someone doing with the woman I'm going to be with or the man I'm going to be with. So those are just some guidelines. There's more, but there's not more time. In fact, there's less time I wanted to leave much more than I have, but I wanted to give some time for questions. And there were some questions. If somebody has some written down, I'll be glad to take them. If there are none written down, I'll just take them from the floor. Yes, there's some hands. I see that hand, yes.
Yeah, how should a person in a marriage handle something if there has been like surgeries or something to where it's almost impossible for them to
Engage in sex, yeah.
intimacy?
I know of cases like that, yeah. What if a person's married to someone and their spouse, because of surgery or chronic pain or some other issue, simply can't be involved sexually? That's when you really learn how to draw near to God and to see your spouse as something other than a sex object, but someone as a suffering person who your God is sending you to minister to in every way that will be a blessing to them. I had a friend in Idaho who shocked me one day. He and his wife loved each other very much, but he said they hadn't had sex for 7 years. Oh my goodness, how can you do that? Well, he just said, well, she's got pain. She absolutely cannot be engaged in it. But on the other hand, I knew another man in Idaho who his wife also was very sickly and couldn't be involved sexually very much, but they worked it out. You know, there are other ways for a wife to minister to her husband's needs in that area besides having sex. And I think that a couple has got to be always mindful of the needs of their spouse. And if you happen to be the one who can't perform or whatever, and your wife still has needs, then of course you've got to find ways. You know, it may not be gratifying to you so much, but you got to try to minister to her needs, and she should do the same. You got to be creative. The main thing is it shouldn't be assumed that, well, we just can't have ordinary, sex because of this health issue. Well, maybe there's not much else you can do either, but if there's something else you can do, it's better than nothing. I mean, the husband and wife are still charged with protecting their spouse from the temptations outside the marriage. And if the man or the woman can't perform normally, they don't want their spouse to be getting tempted, for lack of activity. So, you need to talk to each other. Yeah. Yeah, they may not be able to do anything. In that case, you need to be a monk, It can't be done. You need to ask God for the grace. And as I said, then you have to take some of the approaches that a single person takes, Develop a deep friendship level relationship that's so you don't feel lonely or rejected. A lot of times it's harder if there's not actual normal sexual activity in the marriage. Part of the big problem is feeling of rejection. And a lot of times that may not be a factor. You feel rejected because they're not interested, but they're not rejecting you,
And I also feel that the suppression is, when you were talking earlier about suppression with people, like when they say to teenagers or whatever, if you're not having sex or whatever, like
Mm-hmm.
you're suppressing your urges. I think it's the other way around. I think this pill afforded us to believe that we're supposed to have this enormous sex life.
Yeah.
That is actually not natural.
The cultural norms now are just the opposite of what they were for so long, and definitely the opposite of what Christianity is. But a man can live with his wife when she's not sexually available. Frankly, I had a wife like that it was rejection. It wasn't sickness. It wasn't anything like that. She had other men, and she came home to me, but we weren't doing anything. So and that went on for years. So, not 7 years, thankfully, but she's the one who ran off eventually and with someone else and divorced me. But there was a while there I had to practice, what I preach here. In fact, I always have to practice what I preach. But you can be married and still have the same struggles a single person has, but you have to be faithful to God in that situation too. There are so many different situations. Some people are much harder situations than others. And that man I knew he and his wife just couldn't have sex and hadn't had sex for 7 years. I just thought, oh, man, that sucks to be him. Thank God that I'm not in that situation. But then I was single for 10 years after my last marriage failed. And I had to be celibate, But at least I didn't have to come home and live with a woman and be celibate. It's a lot easier to be celibate when you're not living with somebody that you find attractive, I mean, you can at least avoid them. It's like when you're fasting, it's best to stay out of the kitchen, If you're fasting, it's a lot easier if you're not near the refrigerator, And if you're trying to be sexually abstinent, it's a lot easier when a sexually attractive party's not living in the same house with you. But even if they are, then you just got to man up and somehow be stronger than you otherwise would have to be, and find other alternatives for your mind to do legitimate things that take your mind off that if possible. You had your hand up.
Yes. I'm thinking back to a statement that you made earlier about the virgin birth of the Messiah was the only virgin birth
Uh-huh.
before and none after.
Right.
So my mind goes immediately to Isaiah 7 and 8, where it talks about the prophet Isaiah coming to the king of Judah, and he's talking about this war and allies going to be happening, and he basically says that will be the length of this wartime will be no longer than when this virgin
Yeah.
gives birth to a son, and then that happens in chapter 8. So I'm
Right.
curious,
The prophecy about the virgin birth in Isaiah 7:14 is really about Isaiah's son, who's born in the next chapter. But that's a type and a shadow of the Messiah's birth. So it has kind of a typological fulfillment. But Isaiah's wife was not a virgin. I mean, she conceived, but she wasn't a virgin. She was his wife. I mean, it specifically says in chapter 8, verse 1, God said to me, go into the prophetess, and so she'll conceive. And so she wasn't a literal virgin. Now, the way that works out is the word alma in the Hebrew means a young woman. Most young women are virgins, so the word alma often refers to a virgin. And but it really just means a young woman. Now, so Isaiah, his wife was a young woman, and she conceived. It was not a miraculous thing at all. Now, it did apply to a miraculous actual virgin in the case of Jesus. But see, the word alma can mean a virgin or just a young woman. Interestingly, when the Greek translation of the Old Testament was made by the Jews, the Septuagint, that passage that says in Isaiah 7, which says the alma, the virgin, the young woman shall conceive, the Greek translators use the word parthenos, which is the word virgin, not young woman. And so the Bible that was used by the Jews for 300 years before Jesus was born said an actual virgin would be. But in Isaiah's day, that's not the word that God used. But that's a complicated thing. But yeah, Jesus' mother, Mary, was the only woman who was a literal virgin who ever conceived and had children. Isaiah's wife, in a sense, fulfilled that prophecy in a typological, preliminary way, but she wasn't physically a virgin. And the Bible specifically mentions that they had they joined together and had a baby. Yeah. Others? Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
I had a question. Yesterday you were talking about relationships in the church, and you were saying you were in a church for a while, about 3 years, in a Calvinist setting, and you didn't really speak up about it. Eventually they found out. Well, the church I'm in, we love my family, love it, and love of Christ is there, I believe. But some of the pastors kind of infuse, there's a little bit of word of faith kind of stuff, and that's hard. I do talk. I have good discussions with members of the church and the pastor. And yeah, I'm not sure how to speak about it. I don't want to cause discord. Should I just be silent?
Well, okay, you're in a church where some people are word of faith, or the church leans that way, and you're not, and you're wondering if you should just not talk about it for the sake of peace. Well, if you find that for the sake of peace you have to not talk about it, then yes. I do believe word of faith is a serious error, but it's not one that you have to alienate all other Christians who are making that error from you when you probably can't change their mind anyway. Now, if somebody's interested in what you have to say, then that means, by definition, I would think if they're interested in what you have to say, they want you to tell them why you disagree, and they're not going to be offended that you do. I mean, there are situations where you disagree with the doctrine of the church, and you just have to keep your mouth silent because they're threatened by anyone who doesn't go along with the standard view of their group. But there are people who are more mature about it, you know, and so as far as whether you should be silent for the sake of peace, I'd say you should only be silent if that's necessary to do for the sake of peace. You can sometimes have peace in a situation where you're not silent, where you're having discussions. You know, it says in Ephesians 4:15, speaking the truth in love, we may grow up into him in all things who is the head, Christ. And the church matures as we talk about these things, but we have to do it in love. When people don't want to talk about it, and they just get offended when you do, well, either you're talking in a way that's not sufficiently loving, or they're just too immature to love you in the face of that difference. I mean, you've got to work with what you've got. You've got to work with the people that are there, or else go somewhere else and find other people. But like you said, God has you in a relationship with lots of these people. It's ridiculous to have to break up your friendships and your relationships in the body of Christ because they can't tolerate you having a difference of opinion. If you find that that is the way it is, you got to go and bite the bullet and say, I guess I have to make some more friends, but it shouldn't have to be that way. You should be able to have a disagreement, and they should be able to disagree with you, and that shouldn't mean that you can't continue to be iron sharpening iron and learning from each other and so forth. Yeah. Yes, brother.
Could we talk about post-tribulation for a second?
You want to talk about post-trib for a second? If you want, sure.
You mentioned George Ladd, that you knew who he was.
Mm-hmm.
He had a book, The Blessed Hope.
Yep, absolutely.
I think you would disagree on the millennium with him, but did you think he did a sound argument in supporting post-tribulationism? And secondly, I've been looking for a long time. Is there a definitive book on post-tribulationism?
There are a few authors that have distinguished themselves writing about post-tribulationism. By post-tribulationism, I assume you're meaning the view that George Eldon Ladd held, which is called historic premillennialism. Yeah, he held a future millennium, but he didn't believe in a pre-trib rapture. There's two kinds of premillennialism. All premillennialism believes there will be a millennium after Jesus comes back. That's what premillennialism means. Before the millennium, Jesus comes back. But there's two kinds of premillennialism. There's the pre-trib, which is dispensationalist, and then there's the post-trib, which is historic premillennialism. It's called that because way back in church history in the first 3 centuries, there were some premillennialists, but they weren't pre-trib. And so we call their view historic premillennialism, whereas dispensationalism, that is pre-trib, came up in the 1800s. It doesn't have a long history. Now, George Eldon Ladd was historic premillennial. I have a good friend in Fresno, or Oakhurst, actually, I'll be seeing tomorrow, who's historic premillennial. Dr. Michael Brown is a Jewish Christian guy who's historic premillennial, and he writes a lot of books. In fact, I think he and another writer are just coming out with a book on premillennialism. I'm not sure. You look at Michael L. Brown is the author. Now I've had my debates with him on other issues, but he's a good man, and he's a historic premill. That's what Ladd was. There are some other people. There's a guy who wrote some books on post-trib back in the 70s, and I knew his name then, but I forget it now. It's been many years. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Robert Gundry was one post-millennial, not post-tribulationist too. So there are others out there. I think I'd look up Gundry, and of course you've got Ladd, but you don't really need too many books on that because Ladd did make a good case, and there's not much else to say. Other authors may say same things in different ways, but the case for pre-trib is the case for post-trib is there's no pre-trib in the Bible. You know, the rapture happens when Jesus returns. That's what Paul says at the resurrection. When Jesus returns, that's when the rapture occurs. And that's the post-trib thing. The dispensation says, no, he doesn't rapture, then he raptures us 7 years before that, and then he comes 7 years later. That's the pre-trib. And there's not a verse in the Bible that says anything like that.
He points out that, as you recall, anything supporting a pre-trib rapture is an inference
like he comes like a thief. Well, that means he's going to come and steal the church. Well, it doesn't say he's going to come steal the church.
Right.
Because he's going to come unexpectedly.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, I was pre-trib for a long time, and what got me out of it is realizing that all the verses that I used to support pre-trib were, like you said, inferences. I was assuming the pre-trib rapture and reading it into those verses, and they worked for that. But if I didn't already accept a pre-trib rapture, none of those verses would have been at all persuasive. Yeah, and that's the problem. That's why there was no pre-trib rapture in the church until the 1800s, because there's nothing in the Bible that teaches it. But once someone came up with it, they can read it into this verse and that verse and that verse, and that's what, of course, they do. And that's what I used to do. Yes, time to quit.
I'm the bad guy.
You got.
Usually we try and have you come when I'm off, but I have to be at work in an hour, and Westside's kind enough to let us use the building. I do come to this church, but I am not a pastor or leader or anything
Yeah.
like that. So they give me the keys, and they have at it, and but unfortunately, I got a boogie.
He's got to leave in 5 minutes, so we need to be out of the building in 5 minutes.
But the cleaning crew is here as well, so we've got lots of things working against us tonight. But thank you, Steve, so much, and sorry about your questions if they couldn't come. We don't usually have time limits, but unfortunately tonight we do.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for coming. Here we go here. There we go.